The photograph of Cal was still propped on the sideboard when Dean slid an aerial map across the kitchen table and gave his mother the farm nobody could save. "The West place would be yours outright," he said. "House, sheds, all 180 acres. No partnership debt attached." On the map, the property looked clean and manageable, a green rectangle divided by white boundary lines. The photograph did not show the collapsed culvert, the drowned lower field, or the farmhouse whose back steps had pulled away from the foundation. Russell stared into his coffee. Dean tapped the map with a trimmed fingernail. "It's the safest arrangement for you." Ruth Bell looked from one son to the other. Two men in their 40s, both wearing caps from the machinery dealership, both waiting for their mother to be grateful for land they had spent 10 years calling hopeless. Before either of them was born, she had run that farm. Neither son knew it. Ruth folded the map along the property line, pressed the crease with her thumbnail, and said, "All right." Russell's head came up. Dean leaned back so quickly his chair squeaked. It was the first honest sound anybody had made all morning. The kitchen still smelled faintly of ham. For 9 days after Cal's funeral, people had arrived carrying food in disposable pans, as if grief could be crowded off the counter by enough baked cheese. Most of it was gone now. Ruth had frozen what she could, sent a pan of scalloped potatoes home with Marlene, and thrown away a bowl of macaroni salad after it developed a shine she did not trust. Dean had moved the sugar jar to make room for his folders. Ruth moved it back. He watched her do it. "Mom, I need to make sure you understand what I'm proposing. You've used the word outright 3 times. Because it matters. So does my sugar jar." Russell made a sound that might have become a laugh if Dean had not looked at him. Ruth poured herself more coffee. Cal's mug was beside the sink, washed and upside down on a towel. It had a hairline crack near the handle and the words, "World's Okayest Farmer," printed on the side. Marlene had given it to him for his 65th birthday. Cal had laughed until he wheezed, then used it every morning for 3 years. Ruth had not been able to put it in the cupboard. Dean opened the top folder. The operating partnership owes just under $600,000, counting the equipment notes. The home place and the dealership can service that if Russell and I consolidate. You shouldn't have to spend your retirement worrying about operating debt. My retirement, you know what I mean. I'm checking. He exhaled through his nose. Dean had done that since he was 20 and discovered impatience made some people hurry. It had never worked on Ruth, though he kept returning to it like an old tool with a stripped gear. "The West Farm has no mortgage against it," he said. "That's the point. Clean title, clean break. And no crop worth taking to the elevator," Russell said. Dean turned. "We discussed this." "No, you discussed it. I listened while you discussed it at me." Russell's hands remained wrapped around his mug. He had Cal's broad palms and Ruth's habit of picking at a thumbnail when he was worried. He was worrying it raw now. Dean's voice softened, which made it more dangerous. "Do you want Mom tied to our debt? No. Do you want her house exposed if we have another bad year? No, but then don't confuse the issue." Ruth let the silence sit. She had learned long ago that if she did not rescue people from silence, they often filled it with something useful. Russell did not. Dean straightened the stack of papers. "You'd have options, Mom. You could lease the acreage. You could sell. Consolidated Prairie is still buying in the county, and they pay cash." There it was, placed lightly on the table as if it had wandered in by itself. "How do you know they're still buying?" Ruth asked. Dean's thumb stopped against the folder edge. "They advertise." "Where?" "Everywhere. I must have missed the commercials between the heart pills and the reverse mortgages." Russell looked down again, but not before Ruth saw color climb into his face. Dean gave her a patient smile. "I made a few calls after Dad went into the hospital, just to understand our choices." Cal had gone into the hospital on a Tuesday complaining that the chicken at supper had been dry. It had not been dry. He had eaten half of it, put his fork down, and asked Ruth why somebody had parked a red truck in their dining room. There was no truck. By midnight, a doctor was explaining the difference between a major stroke and a survivable one, careful not to use the word hope. Cal died on Friday. "You called land buyers that week?" Ruth asked. "I called everybody that week." The answer was honest enough to hurt differently. Dean had also called the insurance company, the bank, the equipment lenders, the funeral home, and the minister Cal privately considered a windbag. He had brought Ruth clean clothes without being asked, and remembered her blue cardigan because hospitals were always cold. He had stood at the foot of Cal's bed, gripping the rail so hard his knuckles went pale. People preferred their villains tidy. Dean had never had the courtesy. Ruth set down her coffee. What exactly did Consolidated Prairie say? That they'd consider the West Place as part of their expansion. Consider at what price? We didn't get that far. Then you didn't make a few calls to understand our choices. You made a call to understand one choice. Dean closed the folder. This is why I wanted us to wait. This was your idea of waiting? It has been 9 days. Your father was dead for 7 of them. Russell whispered, "Mom." She looked at him, and he flinched as if she had spoken sharply. Ruth had not raised her voice. She was too tired to raise much of anything. Her black funeral dress still hung on the bedroom door, because she had not wanted it touching Cal's shirts in the closet. Every night she slept on her side of the bed and woke with one hand extended into cold sheets. That morning, she had found one of his peppermints in the washing machine and cried so hard she had to sit on the laundry room floor. Now, her sons were offering her a ruined farm in a tidy folder. She took another sip of coffee. Dean rubbed both hands over his face. For a moment, he looked younger, not like the man who could dismiss a mechanic before lunch and eat meatloaf without losing his appetite, but like the boy who once confessed to breaking a window before Ruth even knew a window was broken. "I'm trying to keep something standing," he said. The weariness in his voice almost undid her. Almost. Ruth reached for the aerial map again. "What does your division give each of you?" "The home acreage remains with the operating partnership," Dean said, business voice back in place. "Russell and I each retain equal shares. The dealership becomes a separate company, also equal shares. We assume the equipment notes and the operating line. You keep this house with lifetime possession, plus the West Farm outright. Lifetime possession means you own this house after I die. Eventually, yes, as Dad intended. Cal had intended many things. He had intended to replace the porch rail, stop salting his eggs, and take Ruth to Savannah once harvest was over. Intention was, the crop men planted when they did not expect anybody to check the yield. "And my share of the machinery?" she asked. Dean reopened the folder. "The West Farm package includes the old Massey tractor, the red combine, the grain wagon, and the implements stored in the West shed. The combine hasn't run in 2 years. It ran 18 months ago. It caught fire 18 months ago. A wiring harness smoked, the seat burned. That can be repaired." Ruth looked at Russell. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Something warm and mean flickered in her chest. Not pleasure exactly. Recognition. Dean continued before she could speak. "The equipment has appraised value whether you use it or sell it." Did the appraiser smell the seat? "Mom, come on." She folded the map a second time, making the West Farm small enough to fit beneath her palm. "You said the land comes to me without partnership debt." "Yes. The deed would be mine." "Yes. I decide whether to lease it, sell it, plant it, or let it grow thistles tall enough to hide this entire family." Dean's mouth tightened. "Within county weed regulations." That time Russell did laugh. It escaped him in one startled bark, and Ruth laughed too, though it pulled strangely in her throat. Even Dean's mouth twitched before he remembered the meeting was supposed to be serious. The laugh left a worse silence behind it. Ruth studied the two of them. Dean believed he was protecting the pieces with the best chance of surviving. Russell believed his discomfort counted as resistance. Both believed the West Farm would frighten her into selling quickly. What neither understood was that Ruth was not frightened by bad ground. Bad ground told the truth sooner than people did. "I'll take it," she said. Dean blinked. "We should have the attorney review, of course, and the tax implications. Of course. I'm not asking you to sign today." "Good, because you haven't given me anything to sign." His gaze moved to the folded map under her hand. "Then, what are you saying?" "I'm saying the division you proposed is the division I accept, assuming the numbers are what you claim, and the property comes to me clean." Russell sat back. "You don't want to think about it? I have. For 4 minutes. For longer than that." Dean leaned forward. "Mom, if this is pride, don't hand me a dead farm and complain that I'm proud enough to bury it myself." The words landed harder than Ruth intended. Russell stared at the table. Dean's face closed. She was suddenly too tired to sit upright. "Leave the folders," she said. "I'll look through them." Dean collected his pen, but not the papers. "We're trying to do right by you." Ruth believed he believed it. That was the worst part. "I know what you're trying to do." At the back door, Russell stopped to put on his jacket. Dean was already outside, speaking into his phone before the screen door shut behind him. Russell kept one hand on the knob. I told him the West place wasn't fair. When? He glanced through the glass. Dean paced beside his pickup, free hand moving as he talked. Before. Before what? This? That covers a lot of history. Russell's thumb found the ragged edge of his nail. I said we should sell everything and split it 3 ways. And when Dean said no, I'm not the one who makes every decision. No, Ruth said. You just sign your name beneath them. He looked as if she had slapped him. Ruth wished briefly and shamefully that she could take it back. Then he said, Dad didn't leave us a good situation. Your father is not here to defend his mistakes. I'm not attacking him. You're placing him where you usually place yourself, just outside the room where the decision got made. Russell opened the door. Cold air swept across the kitchen floor. You really going to take that farm? I said I was. Why? Ruth looked at the folded map. Because she knew where the original drain emptied beneath a stand of cottonwoods. Because she remembered the year the West field produced corn taller than Cal's shoulder, and the next year it produced almost nothing. Because old Mr. Bell had once told her that land would tolerate greed for about as long as a good woman would, and both were capable of surprising a man who miscalculated. But those memories belonged to a Ruth her sons had never bothered to meet. Because your brother wants me to sell it, she said. Russell waited for more. When none came, he went outside. Ruth stood at the window while their trucks rolled down the lane, Dean first and Russell following in the dust. Then she carried Cal's mug from beside the sink to the table and set it on the aerial map. By noon, Marlene's Buick was in the driveway. You accepted what? Marlene demanded before removing her coat. The West Farm. That swamp with a mailbox? The mailbox fell over. Then it's a swamp without amenities. Ruth put on her boots. Marlene watched her pull a knit cap over her gray hair. Where are we going? To look at my farm. The West place was 6 miles away. They drove past bare soybean fields, a shuttered feed store, and a church sign that said, Faith makes things possible, not easy. Well, Marlene said, reading it, at least the Lord has started adding disclaimers. Ruth laughed, and for half a mile the ache in her chest loosened. The West farmhouse appeared beyond a row of wind-bent pines, its white paint gone gray. The equipment shed leaned east. Rusted wire sagged between fence posts, and brown water filled the ditch along the road. Marlene parked without turning off the engine. Oh, Ruth. Ruth got out. The wind smelled of wet earth and dead grass. Her knees protested as she crossed the soft yard, but she kept going until she reached the edge of the lower field. Water lay across it in silver sheets. To anyone else, it looked ruined. Ruth followed the old slope with her eyes, past the drowned rows, toward the cottonwoods at the far boundary. Beneath those trees was a clay outlet installed before either of her sons drew breath. If it still existed, it would be buried, cracked, and useless. She stood in the cold long enough for Marlene to come beside her. Can it be saved? Marlene asked. Ruth watched the water sitting where corn had no business being planted. Not the way they mean, she said. Marlene shoved her hands deeper into her coat pockets. Is there another way to mean it? There used to be. That is not an answer. That is something an old woman says before crows fly out of a cornfield. We're both old women. I'm older than you by 11 months, and I have never knowingly invited a crow into a conversation. Ruth walked along the edge of the yard, avoiding the ruts where someone had driven through after the last hard rain. The farmhouse door stood crooked in its frame. The tenant had left 6 months before Cal's stroke, and nobody had bothered to heat the place through winter. One pane in the kitchen window was cracked. The porch gutter hung down like a loose suspender. The key Dean had left in the folder was still at home. Ruth cupped her hands against the kitchen glass. Inside, a vinyl chair lay on its side. Cabinet doors stood open, and a calendar from 2 years ago remained pinned beside the refrigerator space. It showed a photograph of a red barn that had never known mud. You thinking of moving out here? Marlene asked. No. Good. I don't have enough casseroles left in me for that. Ruth stepped away from the window. The house can wait. For demolition? For a roof estimate. Marlene stared at her. You meant it at the kitchen table. What did you think I meant? I thought you were making Dean uncomfortable. I supported that. I can do 2 things at once. Ruth crossed toward the equipment shed. Its sliding door had come off the lower track, leaving a gap wide enough to look through. The red combine sat inside with dust dulling its paint. One rear tire was low. The cab window was blackened near the corner, where the seat fire had scorched the interior. Beside it stood the old Massey tractor, square-nosed and faded to the color of dried blood. Ruth felt an unreasonable tenderness for it. Marlene peered through the gap. That's what they gave you for equipment? And a grain wagon. Where? Good question. Maybe the wagon escaped. Ruth walked around the shed and found it behind a thicket of burdock, tilted on one soft tire. A walnut sapling had grown through the hitch. Marlene folded her arms. Strong case for escape. Ruth touched the rough bark. The sapling was thick enough that it had not appeared last season. Dean had listed the wagon without looking at it. Perhaps nobody had. Her anger settled into something colder and more useful. She took out her phone. "Who are you calling?" Marlene asked. "Thomas." "On purpose?" "He knows machinery. He also told Cal to scrap that combine after the seat caught fire. That's why I'm calling him." Thomas Vega answered on the fifth ring with the clatter of metal behind him. "If this is about your Buick, tell Marlene I don't work on noises that disappear when a mechanic gets close." Marlene leaned toward the phone. "It does it mostly uphill. They all do something uphill." Ruth said, "I need you to look at the West Farm." The clatter stopped. "Look at what part?" "All of it." There was a pause long enough for the wind to push dead grass against the fence. "I heard Dean was selling it," Thomas said. "He heard that too. Cal told me Consolidated Prairie had asked twice. Cal didn't tell me. Cal didn't tell anybody anything until it had an oil leak." Ruth could not argue with that. Thomas cleared his throat. "What do you want from me?" "An honest list. Machinery, sheds, well, house, if you can stand to go inside. I'll get someone else for the roof and foundation. You don't own it yet." "I will." Another pause. "You buy it from the boys?" "No. They gave it to me." "Gave?" "Yes." "That sounds worse." Marlene nodded vigorously. Ruth turned away from her. "Can you come tomorrow?" "I can come Saturday." "What do you charge?" "Ruth." "What do you charge?" "You fed me enough meals to cover an inspection. I fed you because Cal thought lunch appeared when men became hungry. That was his understanding of agriculture." "I'll pay you." Thomas sighed. 30 an hour. "You charge Dean 65. I like you better. Charge me 50. "Why are you arguing upward?" "Because I want an inspection, not a favor." He went quiet again. Ruth pictured him at his workbench, glasses pushed into his graying hair, deciding whether she was grieving or foolish, and too decent to name either possibility. "Saturday at 8, he said. "Bring the keys. And don't start that combine. I hadn't planned to. I knew Cal for 34 years. Planning not to start a machine means nothing in your family." He hung up. Marlene looked at Ruth with reluctant admiration. "You bullied him into taking more money. I negotiated. You sounded exactly like Cal." The comparison struck where Marlene had not aimed it. Ruth put her phone away. "No. Cal would have promised him 40 and paid him 25 6 months late." Marlene's mouth opened, then closed. They walked down the lane toward the lower field. Last year's cornstalks stood in gray broken clusters. Mud clung to Ruth's boots, adding weight with every step. Near the first rise, she stopped. A shallow channel ran across the field, almost erased by years of tillage. She could still see its curve. Water had once moved through there toward the meadow, not quickly, but without standing deep enough to drown the crop. Cal's father, Walter, had distrusted any acre that did not send something to market. During Ruth's first season managing the place, however, he had been recovering from pneumonia and too weak to interfere daily. Ruth had left the lower 40 in grass because spring rain made planting impossible. By July, cattle grazed there, and the corn above it held through 2 storms. Walter had called her lucky. The next year, after Cal recovered from his accident and returned to work, Walter installed more tile and pushed the field into corn. The yield was good enough for him to call himself right. One good season could keep a bad idea alive for decades. Marlene had fallen several steps behind. "You're walking like you're 25. I hurt less at 25. You complained more. I had more time for it." At the line of cottonwoods, the ground dropped sharply. Brambles covered the bank, and rainwater threaded between exposed roots. Ruth found the mouth of the old clay outlet where she remembered it, though only a broken reddish curve remained above the mud. She crouched, one hand braced on her knee. "Don't," Marlene said. "I'm looking." "You're crouching. Looking can be done vertically at our age." Ruth brushed dead leaves aside. The pipe had cracked in several places. Roots filled the opening. Even if it were cleared, it served only an older, shallower system. The tile installed afterward would run elsewhere, probably into a buried junction she could not locate without equipment. No simple fix waited beneath the leaves. She was relieved. A simple fix would have been another version of Dean's thinking. One repair, one sale, one clever answer that allowed the land to remain exactly what it had become. Ruth straightened slowly. Her left knee made a small, grinding complaint. "Well?" Marlene asked. "The outlet's dead. You sound pleased." "I'm pleased I didn't imagine it. That's a low standard for celebration." They returned to the Buick with mud on their boots and nothing resembling a plan. Marlene drove Ruth home, objecting only twice when Ruth asked her to slow down near the west boundary. At the kitchen table, the folders remained where Dean had left them. Cal's mug sat on top of the folded map like a paperweight. Marlene removed her coat and put water on for tea without asking. She had married Cal's younger brother, Frank, at 19 and divorced him at 37, but she kept Ruth in the settlement. Frank now lived in Arizona with a woman who sold handmade soap online and described all unpleasantness as energy. Marlene carried 2 mugs to the table. "What aren't you telling your boys?" "Which part?" "The part where you looked at that flooded field like it had insulted you personally." Ruth opened the first folder. "I managed the West Place after Cal got hurt." "I know." "They don't." "Whose fault is that?" Ruth looked up. Marlene blew across her tea. "That wasn't an accusation. It was a question with poor manners. Cal and I didn't hide it. You let it become a story about how you helped while he recovered. I did help. You ran the place. For 11 months. You fired Lloyd Baxter. He came to work drunk. You made Walter Bell return seed corn he bought from his poker friend. It had terrible germination. You got 40 acres planted while Cal was still walking with a cane. And then all 3 Bell men spent the next 20 years telling people you kept things organized." Ruth turned a page she had not read. Marlene's voice softened. "You could tell Dean." "What would that change? He might stop talking to you like you're a decorative pillow. Dean would explain why farming is different now." "It is different now. I know that." "He doesn't know I know it?" Marlene sat back. "So, this is revenge?" "No. A little." Ruth read the equipment schedule. The Massey was assigned a value that might have been accurate 10 years ago. The damaged combine was valued as operable. A seed drill was listed, though Ruth had not seen it in the shed. She turned another page. "If I wanted revenge," she said, "I'd let Dean keep that combine." Marlene laughed into her tea. Ruth found the property expense sheet, taxes, insurance estimate, average utility costs for the farmhouse, projected lease income based on 160 plantable acres. She read the last figure twice. "Here," she said. Marlene leaned over. "They're valuing the farm as if a tenant can plant nearly all of it, can't they?" "They can. They just can't harvest nearly all of it." Dean had used the same optimistic acreage that had helped exhaust the place. Either he had not looked closely, or he had looked and counted on Ruth not knowing the difference. Her telephone rang. Dean's name appeared on the screen. Ruth let it ring once more before answering. "I spoke to Consolidated Prairie," he said without greeting. "Their acquisitions manager can walk the West Place Monday afternoon." "No." A brief silence followed. "No, Monday doesn't work. No, he can't walk it." "Mom, hearing an offer doesn't commit you. I don't own the farm yet, and you're already inviting buyers onto it. I'm trying to save time." "Whose?" Dean's breath came across the line. "You said you accepted the division." "I did." "Then I don't understand the problem." Ruth looked at Cal's cracked mug, the inflated equipment schedule, and the map folded small beneath it. "The problem," she said, "is that you gave me the farm, Dean." She slid the expense sheet toward Marlene. "So, get off it." Dean went quiet long enough that Ruth could hear a turn signal clicking through the phone. "You don't own it yet," he said. "Then stop trying to sell something that still belongs partly to me. That isn't what I'm doing. You scheduled a buyer, I scheduled a conversation. Have it at your house." Marlene lifted her tea in silent approval. Dean's turn signal stopped. "We need cash, Mom." There was no business polish on the words, just a tired man driving somewhere in Cal's pickup, asking his mother to notice the water coming into his boat. Ruth's anger did not disappear. It changed temperature. How badly, she asked. We'll manage. That's not a number. I'm not discussing the partnership's finances until we finalize the division. You're asking me to solve those finances by selling. I'm asking you to consider a fair offer for ground you can't use. You don't know what offer they'll make. They've paid up to $8,500 an acre nearby, for ground with good drainage and road frontage on two sides. They want contiguous acreage for waste management. Ruth's fingers tightened around the phone. Waste management was the clean phrase. The actual plan would mean sheds full of hogs, concrete pits, tanker traffic, and manure spread across more land than the farm could absorb. Consolidated Prairie did not want the West Place because they believed in its soil. They wanted distance from neighbors who could afford to object. Did you tell them I'd sell? She asked. No. Did you let them think I would? Mom. Cancel Monday. Will you at least look at their preliminary figures? No. What if the number is good? Then it will still be good after the farm belongs to me. Dean made a frustrated sound. Every month we wait costs us. That sounds like a problem in the part of the operation you kept. She regretted it as soon as she said it, not enough to retract it, but enough that the quiet afterward pressed against her ribs. Dean finally said, Dad would hate this. Ruth looked toward Cal's mug. Your father hated a lot of things he eventually survived. He didn't survive this. The line went dead. Marlene stared at Ruth. That was low. Yes, I meant him. I know. Ruth set the phone down carefully. Her hand had begun to shake. Marlene reached across the table, then stopped before touching her. It was one of the things Ruth loved about her. Marlene knew comfort could become another demand if delivered too quickly. He'll call back, she said. He always does. Cal said the same thing about you. Cal said, I always came back? No. He said you always called back after hanging up on him. He sounded impressed. I never hung up on Cal. You did at least twice while I was present. The wall phone had a loose cord. Both times? Ruth took the equipment schedule and aligned its edge with the folder. Drink your tea. By Saturday morning, frost had hardened the ruts at the West Place. Ruth arrived 10 minutes early and found Thomas already there in an old gray service truck, drinking coffee from a stainless steel cup. He climbed out wearing insulated coveralls and a knitted cap pulled low over his ears. His beard had gone almost entirely white since Ruth last saw him at the hospital. He had come to Cal's room once, stood near the door for 3 minutes, and left before Cal woke. At the funeral, he remained in the back row and slipped away before the lunch. He looked at Ruth's boots. Those waterproof? They were when I bought them. When was that? None of your business. Then I brought extra socks. He took a clipboard from the truck and handed her a flashlight. No condolences, no careful inquiry about how she was holding up. Ruth was grateful enough to resent him for it. The farmhouse key resisted the lock. Thomas worked it gently, lifting the sagging door as he turned. You force it, the key'll snap, he said. I know how a door works. You called me for honesty. I called you about machinery. My rate includes doors. The door opened on a smell of mouse droppings, cold plaster, and old cooking grease. Thomas put on a respirator and gave Ruth one from his bag. You travel prepared for cheerful occasions, she said. I worked for your husband. They moved room by room. The kitchen ceiling was stained near the chimney. 2 copper pipes beneath the sink had split from freezing, though the well pump might already have been dead before that. The living room floor dipped along the outer wall. Upstairs, wind stirred a curtain through the cracked window. Ruth stood in the smallest bedroom, where faded blue flowers climbed the wallpaper. She had slept there during Cal's recovery, because the drive home after midnight felt longer each night. Cal had stayed downstairs on a cot while his leg healed. Walter Bell slept in the front bedroom and complained that Ruth made too much noise at dawn. She had been 24 and so tired that once she poured coffee into the sugar bowl, Thomas knocked his knuckles against the window frame. Rotten wood broke loose and fell to the floor. Don't do that again, Ruth said. It's my inspection technique. You're creating defects. I'm uncovering them. You enjoy that word. Roof leaks in 4 places. Chimney flashing's bad. Plumbing needs replacement in the kitchen and probably the bathroom. Furnace is old enough to remember Kennedy. Foundation might be stable, might not. You need somebody qualified. Can it be kept dry? With money, how much? Enough that you should decide what the house is for before you spend it. Ruth lowered her respirator. Not everything needs a purpose before you keep it. No, but roofs charge whether you're sentimental or not. He did not look at her when he said it. Tomas had never married. For years he had cared for his mother in a narrow house behind the Catholic church, arranging his work around her worsening lungs. After she died, he sold the house within a month and moved into an apartment over his shop. Cal called that practical. Ruth had thought it looked like grief moving faster than the person carrying it. "I'm not moving here," she said. "Then keep the water out and leave the rest alone." In the equipment shed, Thomas walked around the combine twice without touching it. He climbed to the cab, peered through the scorched opening, and came back down. "Parts machine," he said. "It's valued at $27,000. It has parts in it worth something. How much something? Maybe 8 if we find the right buyer. 6 if we're tired of looking. And if I repair it? You'll own a repaired combine too old for most operations and too large for the acreage that ought to be planted here." Ruth felt a small sting of approval. "Write that down. I already did." The Massey took more of his time. He checked fluids, hoses, belts, and battery leads, then lay on a piece of cardboard to look beneath it. "Try it," he said. "You told me not to start anything. I told you not to start the combine. You hear rules selectively." The tractor coughed 3 times before catching. Gray smoke rolled toward the rafters. The engine settled into an uneven but familiar thump. Ruth sat behind the wheel, hands on the cold rim. For a moment she could see Cal leaning through the open cab door with a thermos, asking why she had not finished the north fence. She had thrown a glove at him. He caught it and wore it home, leaving her with one bare hand. Thomas shouted over the engine, hydraulic pumps whining. So did Cal. The pump can be rebuilt. Cal couldn't. Thomas turned away too fast. Ruth shut off the tractor. The silence afterward rang. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." He wrote something on the clipboard. His handwriting became very small. He would have laughed. He laughed at his own jokes. Somebody had to. They found the missing seed drill in a second shed behind the farmhouse, half covered by a tarp and buried under empty chemical jugs. Thomas estimated it would take 2 days merely to pull everything out and see whether mice had destroyed the hoses. The grain wagon remained where Ruth had found it, held to the earth by the walnut sapling. Thomas stood with his hands on his hips. "That one appears occupied. I have been advised. You can cut the tree. I like the tree better. Tree doesn't haul grain, neither does the wagon." He wrote the down too, perhaps just to annoy her. At the lower field, the thaw had softened the ground. Thomas refused to drive the truck closer, so they walked. Ruth's knee hurt before they reached the old channel. She shortened her stride and hoped he would not notice. He noticed. "You want to stop?" "No." "Good. I hate asking." The broken clay outlet sat beneath the cottonwoods, exactly as it had 2 days earlier. Thomas crouched, pushed a thin rod into the mud, and shook his head. "This line's done. I know. New tile across the low ground would cost more than it's worth. You'd be chasing failures. Drain one section, water finds the next low spot. I know. Then why'd you bring me? To see whether you knew." He looked up at her. "You're paying $50 an hour to test me? I'm paying $50 an hour because Dean gave me machinery he values like it runs, acreage he values like it drains, and a house he values like it's habitable. That answer, I believe." They walked to the rise. Wind moved across the broken stalks with a dry, clicking sound. Thomas surveyed the field. You could rent it to somebody who doesn't inspect closely, for 1 season, maybe 2. And then? They curse you at the elevator. I get enough of that for free. He tucked the clipboard beneath his arm. "What are you trying to save, Ruth?" It was not the question Marlene had asked. Marlene meant the property. Thomas meant something else, and Ruth disliked him for hearing it. "I'm trying to find out what I have. You have a bad farm. I had a bad husband some days. I didn't plow him under. That would have improved the drainage." She laughed despite herself, a short sound carried off by the wind. Thomas's expression softened. "You know, fixing this isn't the same as keeping books. Even if you spend half your savings, it won't be what it was. Which year? What? Everyone keeps saying what it was. Which year do they mean? The good corn year? The drought? The year soybeans paid Cal's debts? The year the West 40 flooded twice?" Thomas studied her. Ruth pointed toward the low ground. "That shouldn't be row crop. No, it should never have been drained past the first channel." "Probably not. The rise can grow hay. Maybe soil test first. The upper 80 can still rotate if it hasn't been mined empty. Big if. The west slope could be leased separately. To whom? A white flatbed truck moved along the county road, pulling a trailer stacked with square bales. Evelyn Shaw Forage was painted on the door in dark green letters. Ruth watched it pass. Thomas followed her gaze. Evelyn won't touch ground that wet. I wouldn't ask her to. She'll want a long lease if she has to establish hay. Then she'll have an incentive not to ruin it. You've been out here 2 hours. I've been out here longer than that. Thomas glanced at her, but Ruth was already walking back toward the shed. At his truck, he totaled his time and tried to round down. Ruth corrected the figure and wrote him a check for $150. You don't have to prove you can pay people, he said. I'm proving I intend to. He folded the check into his wallet. Get soil tests. Get a roof estimate. Don't put money into that combine. And don't sign a planting lease based on 160 acres. I know. Also, your left knee hurts. That was not part of the inspection. It was making noise. Ruth waited until his truck disappeared before taking out her phone. Evelyn Shaw answered with a brisk hello. This is Ruth Bell, Ruth said. I have some ground I think you should see. Evelyn did not hesitate. The West Place? Yes. I heard Dean was selling it. So did I. A beat passed, then Evelyn laughed. When do you want me there? She asked. Tuesday, 2 o'clock. I can give you 40 minutes. I'll try not to make the farm larger while you're here. Evelyn laughed again. I've heard about you. That makes one of us. Ruth ended the call and stood beside the Massey with her phone in her hand. The tractor's hood was cold now. Without Thomas's truck or Marlene's Buick in the yard, the West Place felt farther from the road than it was. A crow landed on the shed roof. Ruth looked at it. Don't encourage her. The bird hopped twice along the ridge and flew away. She locked what could be locked and drove home with Thomas's list on the passenger seat. His handwriting filled 4 pages. The final page held estimated values and 3 words underlined twice. Do not plant low. At home, Cal's mug was no longer on the map. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the empty spot. For one sharp second she thought someone had come inside. Then she remembered moving it that morning so she could fill it with coffee. It waited beside the sink, half full and cold. She had used his mug without noticing. Ruth poured out the coffee, rinsed it, and placed it upside down on the towel. After a moment, she turned it upright. On Tuesday, Evelyn Shaw arrived at 153 in the white flatbed, without the bale trailer. She was 52, compact, and moved with the hurried balance of someone accustomed to stepping over things. A brown braid hung through the back of her cap. Mud covered her boots above the ankles. She shook Ruth's hand, then looked past her toward the field. You didn't bring Dean. I didn't invite Dean. Good. He adds 20 minutes to any conversation, and somehow you know less afterward. Ruth liked her immediately and decided not to show it. Evelyn lifted a soil probe from the truck bed. Which ground? Ruth pointed to the rise and the west slope. Not the bottom. Everybody says not the bottom after I arrive. Before I arrive, they describe it as seasonally damp. This is permanently insulted. Evelyn gave the low field one glance. That's honest. They walked the higher ground in a broad loop. Evelyn stopped often, driving the probe into the soil and examining the cores with her thumb. She asked about herbicide history, lime applications, and the last crop rotation. Ruth answered what she knew and wrote down what she did not. Dean kept the records? Evelyn asked. I kept the partnership records until 4 years ago. Then he moved everything into software that generates 6 pages whenever you ask it one question. You can get the application history if he gives me access, and if he doesn't. The co-op has most of it. Evelyn looked sideways at her. You've done this before. Yes. Recently? No, at least you know the difference. They reached the west slope. Evelyn scraped away corn residue with her boot and crouched over a soil core. This has potential, she said. Not pretty potential. I don't need it photographed. Hay establishment will cost me. Seed, fertilizer, spraying, labor. First cutting may be weeds with an alfalfa garnish. What acreage would you take? 35, maybe 40, depending on the tests. I'm not interested in the upper row crop ground. I'm not interested in fixing your fences unless the lease reflects it. I'd want 5 years minimum, control of the cutting schedule, and access through that north gate. The north gate is on Dean's side of the proposed line. Then I'd want another gate. Ruth wrote that down. Evelyn watched her. You don't own this yet. I'm aware. People say a lot before the deed is done. Then don't spend money until it is. I won't. Neither will I. Evelyn smiled. People really have been misdescribing you. They reached the farmhouse with 12 minutes left of Evelyn's 40. Evelyn checked her watch but followed Ruth to the shed. The combine drew an immediate grimace. Dean included that? He values it highly. So does the mouse living in the cab. The Massey runs. Today? Saturday. Saturday is not today. That sounds like something Thomas would say. Thomas believes every machine is waiting for a chance to embarrass him personally. That's because most are. Evelyn rested one boot on the shed threshold. Why are you doing this? Ruth had begun to dislike the popularity of that question. Because I own part of a farm operation. And this is the part my sons proposed I keep. That explains how. Not why. You asked for 40 minutes. I'm efficient. Ruth looked across the yard. The old house appeared worse in daylight. Wind had lifted a strip of roof material near the back chimney. She could pay to keep it dry, sell the combine, lease some hay ground, and still watch the upper fields consume money for years. Knowledge did not reduce the price of fertilizer. Memory did not rebuild a culvert. My husband died, she said. 9 days later, my sons divided his work into what they thought could live and what they thought should be handed to me. I want to know if they were right. Evelyn's face changed, not into pity, but attention. That can get expensive, she said. So can being wrong. Evelyn put the soil probe back in her truck. I'll send the samples under my account. Lab bills you directly. If the results are terrible, we stop. If they aren't, I'll bring you a lease offer that favors me. I'd expect nothing less. As the truck pulled away, Ruth saw a dark pickup slow on the county road. Dean drove past without turning his head. He called that evening. I heard Evelyn Shaw was out there. Do you employ lookouts? I passed her truck. You managed to identify it despite her name being on the door. What does she want? You'd have to ask her. I'm asking you. Ruth held the telephone between her shoulder and ear while peeling a potato. Cooking, for one, had become an absurd exercise in fractions. Half a potato looked stingy. A whole potato felt like a commitment. She may lease some higher ground for hay. Hay. Yes, Dean. You can't commit partnership land to a $5 handshake arrangement. I haven't committed anything. If you're thinking about leasing, the Pritchard brothers would take the full plantable acreage. They tried that last year. They paid. Late. They still paid. They also left the access lanes so rutted, Thomas refused to drive it Saturday. Dean paused. You had Thomas inspect the equipment? I did. You should have told me. Why? Because it's partnership property. You proposed it as my property. Proposed. We have not signed. Ruth cut the potato in half with more force than necessary. You keep using that distinction whenever it benefits you. What is that supposed to mean? It means the farm is mine when you schedule buyers, and yours when I schedule an inspection. That is not fair. No, Ruth said. It isn't. He breathed heavily into the receiver. She could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose. We meet with Warren on Thursday, he said. 11 o'clock. His office. I wrote it down. I need this finished, Mom. So do I. Then stop complicating it. Ruth placed one half of the potato in a bowl of water for tomorrow. Bring the machinery appraisals. I already gave you the schedule. Bring the actual appraisals. He hung up without saying goodbye. Warren Ellis's office occupied the back half of a converted brick house across from the courthouse. The waiting room had beige carpet and a framed watercolor of a barn with every board straight. Ruth arrived at 10:50. Dean was already there, tapping his foot. Russell came in at 11 with his coat half zipped and apologized to everyone, including the receptionist. Warren kept the meeting ordinary. He explained each page, asked each of them whether they understood, and refused to be hurried when Dean checked his watch. The division had been adjusted after Ruth requested independent equipment values. The combine dropped by $18,000. The grain wagon, described by the appraiser as inaccessible for functional testing due to vegetation, dropped almost to scrap value. Dean glanced at Ruth. You could have cut down the tree. It wasn't affecting the wagon's performance. Russell coughed into his fist. The property itself remained the larger unfairness, though no column named it that. Ruth would receive the West Farm, free of partnership debt and the specified equipment. Dean and Russell would receive equal shares of the home operation and dealership, while assuming the debts attached to both. Ruth would retain possession of her home for life. along with a defined amount of cash from Cal's estate and her existing savings. Enough to live modestly, not enough to indulge many mistakes. Warren turned to the last page. You are not required to accept this structure simply because your sons proposed it. I understand. You may want more time. I've had 43 years. Dean shifted in his chair. Warren looked at her over his glasses. That answer does not tell me whether you believe the division is equitable. No, Ruth said. It tells you I know what I'm accepting. She signed. Russell signed next. His pen hovered before touching the paper. Dean signed last, quick and hard, leaving a dot of ink where the tip struck. Outside, the three of them stood on the sidewalk without coats buttoned, as if none expected the conversation to last. Dean held out a single sheet. Consolidated Prairie's preliminary range. Ruth did not take it, at least read it. You own the home place now. Sell them that. You know they need the west acreage for the project. Then they don't have a project. His hand lowered. You'd sacrifice all of this to prove you can farm? Ruth looked at Russell. He watched traffic pass, jaw tight. This isn't a game, Dean said. We have notes due in 6 weeks. You told me you could service the debt. We can, if nothing else goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. That's your answer? My answer is that the West Farm is not for sale. Dean folded the preliminary figures once, then again. Dad built this operation for us. Ruth nearly asked which U.S. he meant. Instead, she stepped closer and straightened the collar of his coat, an old gesture that surprised them both. Your father built it with us, she said. Dean's face went still. Ruth walked to her car before either son could answer. At the West Farm, the new key turned more easily than the old one. Ruth entered the empty kitchen, set Thomas's inspection on the counter, and listened to the wind press against the cracked pane. The place was legally hers now. The roof still leaked. The field still held water. Nothing had improved because 3 people signed their names. Ruth took a roll of black electrical tape from her pocket and sealed the worst crack in the window. It was temporary, unattractive, and insufficient. For the first day, it would have to do. Ruth used the rest of the tape on the upstairs window and 2 gaps where the kitchen frame had pulled from the wall. By the time she finished, the farmhouse looked as if someone had tried to mend it after dark. She swept the kitchen floor with a broom she found in a closet. Mouse droppings, dead flies, and plaster dust gathered in a gray pile. There was no reason to sweep a house without heat, water, or furniture. But the sound of the bristles made the place feel briefly answerable to her. A truck pulled into the yard. Ruth set down the broom and stepped onto the porch. Russell climbed out carrying a cardboard box. Door was open. It sticks. I can plane the edge. No, you can knock. He stopped halfway to the porch. I was going to. You were going to knock after you came inside? I'm still outside. Then the system is working. Russell looked at the box in his arms as if it might explain him. I brought the farm records. Ruth said nothing. Application history, yields, soil tests we had, repair bills for the tile work. Dean said the records belonged with the home operation, but I made copies. Did he tell you to? No. Does he know? Russell shifted the box against his chest. He'll notice they've been printed. So you've upgraded from silent objection to office supply theft. It's our paper. Then your conscience is clear. It's not. That answer softened something in her despite herself. She opened the door wider. Russell carried the box into the kitchen and set it on the counter beside Thomas's inspection. He looked around at the bare cabinets and taped window. You planning to use the house? Everyone asked me that. It's a house. Excellent work. Mom? I don't know yet. He ran his palm over a patch of counter where the old laminate had peeled. Dad talked about tearing it down. Your father talked about tearing down any building after the first repair estimate. He said the foundation was going. Thomas said it might be. You had him inspect the house too? His rate includes doors. Russell smiled before lowering his eyes. Ruth opened the box. The top binder held chemical applications. Below it were printed yield maps, contracts, receipts, and a folder labeled West Tile. Someone had written the label recently in Russell's blocky hand. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Did Dean send you for anything else? No. Did you come for anything else? Russell walked to the cracked window and pressed one finger against the tape. He's angry, I noticed. He says you're making decisions out of grief. What do you say? That everybody is? Ruth looked at him. Russell kept his back turned. Dean's scared. He hides it better than I do. Your brother hides fear by assigning work to other people. He's trying to hold everything together. So am I. I know. The words came quickly, as if he had practiced them in the truck. Ruth sat on the edge of the counter because the vinyl chair was still on its side, and she had not checked it for damage. Why did you sign the division? Russell rubbed the tape with his thumb. I thought you'd sell. That is your brother's answer. It's mine too. Why? Because that's what made the numbers work. There it was. Not cruelty. Arithmetic. Ruth waited. Russell finally turned. The West Place was the only thing we could take out without cutting up the home acreage or selling dealership inventory at a loss. If you sold to Consolidated, you'd have cash, and Dean and I could restructure without your share attached. Everybody walked away with something usable, except the land. It's land, so is a cemetery. Nobody expects it to produce corn. His mouth tightened. You know what I mean? Yes, I usually do. He took a breath. What are you going to plant? Maybe nothing this spring. The alarm on his face came so fast Ruth almost laughed. You can't leave 180 acres idle. Watch me. Weeds will take it. Some will. You'll lose a whole season. I might save one. Russell stared at her as if she had begun speaking another language. Ruth touched the box. I'll read these. If the information's complete, I won't need anything else. That's it? What did you expect? I don't know. A fight. You brought me what I asked for. You didn't ask? No, Ruth said. I didn't. Russell left without planning the door. The records occupied Ruth for 3 days. She read them at her kitchen table, using a yellow legal pad to rebuild 5 seasons field by field. Cal had once teased her for needing paper, when a computer could calculate everything. Ruth liked calculations she could circle. The West Farm's yields told the same story the ground had. The upper fields varied with weather, but remained respectable. The west slope declined gradually as fertilizer costs rose. The low 40 showed sharp losses in wet years and mediocre gains in good ones. Money had been poured into drainage repairs that lasted long enough to justify the next repair. Ruth added the input costs twice because she disliked the first answer. On Friday, a roofer named Hal Dunning met her at the farmhouse. He was broad, red-cheeked, and spoke to the building with more sympathy than he offered Ruth. That chimney's the main trouble, he said, pointing. Flashing failed, decking's soft around it. Backslope has wind damage. You could patch, but you'll patch again. How much to keep it dry for 5 years? 5 exactly, give or take weather. 7,000 if we stabilize the chimney and repair the slopes. 12 if we re-roof the whole thing with basic shingles. More if I start finding rot. You will. I probably will. What would you do? Depends whether you love the house. I asked what you'd do. Hal considered. I'd spend the 12 if I planned to use it. I'd spend the 7 if I needed time to decide. I'd spend nothing if I expected good judgment to appear after another winter. Ruth chose 7. The combine sold the following week for $6,800 to a salvage dealer 2 counties north. Thomas handled the calls, but made Ruth negotiate the final price herself. The buyer tried to reduce it after seeing the burned cab. The photograph showed the cab, Ruth said. Photograph didn't show the rear tire. The tire is holding air, barely. It only has to hold until you load it. He stared at her, then at Thomas. Thomas shrugged. I charge by the hour. Keep talking. The buyer paid Ruth's price. When the flatbed hauled the combine away, deep ruts appeared beside the shed. Ruth watched the red machine disappear down the road and felt no sadness until she saw the empty space it left. The shed seemed larger, older, and ashamed of itself. Thomas came to stand beside her. Roof money, he said, most of it. You could have gotten another $500 in May. The roof leaks in March. Good answer. Don't sound surprised? I'm surprised you didn't keep it because Cal did. Ruth looked at the oil-darkened patch where the combine had sat. Cal kept machines until they became family members. Then he expected everyone to visit them in the shed. Thomas laughed, but Ruth did not. She had sold something Cal would have insisted could be repaired. It was the first farm decision she had made that he could not question, reverse, postpone, or improve while claiming it had been his idea. Freedom, she discovered, could feel disloyal. The soil results arrived that evening. The hay ground's pH was low but correctable. Potassium ran thin. Organic matter was worse than Ruth hoped. The upper fields needed a less aggressive rotation and more lime than she had budgeted. She wrote the estimated costs on her yellow pad. After the roof, insurance, taxes, soil work, and basic repairs to the Massey, her first year could consume almost a quarter of the cash she had received from Cal's estate. That was before seed, fuel, custom work, or income taxes. She drew a box around the total, then turned the page as if the figure might be better from behind. Evelyn brought her lease proposal the next morning. They met at Ruth's kitchen, because the West farmhouse was full of roofing tarps and Hal's ladders. Evelyn declined coffee, accepted it when Ruth poured anyway, and spread 3 pages across the table. 38 acres, Evelyn said. 5 years. Lower rent the first year because I pay establishment costs. Rent increases in years 2 and 3, then holds. How much lower? It's on page 1. I read it. I'm giving you a chance to improve it verbally. Evelyn drank her coffee. I like you less indoors. The feeling is negotiable. They worked through the lease line by line. Evelyn wanted exclusive use of the hay ground and access from March through November. Ruth wanted the right to approve herbicide changes and required ground cover near the channel. Evelyn refused to maintain fences unrelated to her acreage. Ruth agreed, provided Evelyn paid half the cost of adding the northwestern gate. You need that gate more than I do, Evelyn said. You need it every time you bring in equipment. You need it after my lease ends. Then you'll get to use my half for 5 years. Evelyn studied her. Your sons must be exhausted. They've had naps. They settled on the gate. The first-year rent was modest enough to disappoint anyone expecting Ruth to rescue the farm with one agreement. It covered insurance, taxes, and part of the lime. Evelyn would not pay until the deed transfer appeared in the county records, and she confirmed access after spring thaw. At the bottom of the last page, she paused with her pen. You sure about the 5 years? Ruth asked. I'm sure if you are. Why wouldn't I be? Because hay looks slow from the road. People get impatient. Corn prices rise, and suddenly every landowner remembers a cousin who says he can plant the ground for twice the rent. I don't have that cousin. You have Dean. Ruth said nothing. Evelyn signed. Ruth signed beneath her. They drove to the west place to mark the proposed gate and walk the lease boundary. Hal's crew was on the roof, stripping damaged material near the chimney. Thomas had left the Massey outside after taking it to his shop for the hydraulic work. Evelyn stopped beside it. You kept this. It works. Today? Ruth turned the key. The engine caught on the second try. Evelyn nodded as if Ruth had passed a test neither had mentioned. They walked toward the rise carrying orange flags. Halfway there, Ruth noticed fresh tire tracks angling from the road across the upper field. The ruts were narrow and deep, made after yesterday's rain. A white pickup stood near the cottonwoods. 2 men in clean jackets were examining the low ground. Dean stood between them, pointing toward Ruth's field, as if he were already explaining where their buildings would go. Evelyn stopped. Ruth did not. Dean saw her coming and lowered his arm. One of the men smiled professionally. Mrs. Bell? Ruth planted an orange flag at the edge of Evelyn's future hay ground before answering. Yes, I'm Carl Mercer with Consolidated Prairie. Dean thought it would be useful if we saw the drainage limitations firsthand. Dean put both hands in his coat pockets. They were already in the area. Ruth looked at the tire tracks, then at her son. You told me no Monday, he said. It's Thursday. Evelyn made a choking sound that might have been a cough. Ruth walked past Dean to the pickup, reached through its open window, and removed the keys from the ignition. Carl Mercer's smile disappeared. Mrs. Bell, he said. I don't think that's necessary. No, Ruth replied. Neither was the drive. She held out the keys, but when he reached for them, she closed her fingers. You'll take the same route out that you used coming in. Slowly. Then you will not enter this property again unless I invite you. Carl glanced at Dean. Dean's face had gone red. Mom, give him the keys. Ruth looked at her son. Ask properly, she said. Dean's jaw moved once before sound came out. Please give Mr. Mercer his keys. Ruth opened her hand. Carl took them without touching her palm. We certainly didn't mean to trespass. You drove past a mailbox with my name on it. Dean represented that he had permission. Both men looked at Dean. He took one step toward Ruth. I represented that my mother would listen to a serious offer. That is not permission to enter. This isn't some stranger, Mom. This company is prepared to put real money on the table. The table is at my house. Then invite them there. No. Carl cleared his throat. It might be best if we reschedule after everybody's had a chance to discuss the family situation. There is no family situation involving you, Ruth said. His professional smile returned in a thinner form. Understood. The second man had not spoken. He kept glancing at Evelyn, perhaps hoping she would identify herself or reduce the number of women obstructing the afternoon. Evelyn leaned on her soil probe and smiled pleasantly at him. Carl and his companion climbed into the pickup. Ruth stepped aside, but remained close enough that he had to ease backward carefully. The tires rolled through the ruts they had made. When the truck reached the road, Dean said, "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? For them? For me? You brought two men onto property that isn't yours. To look at mud. It's my mud. You're being ridiculous." Ruth looked at the roofers. They had stopped working. Hal pretended to examine a bundle of shingles, while the younger man beside him stared down openly. "Then this must feel familiar," she said. Dean lowered his voice. "They could solve our problem. They could buy my farm. You don't want it. You keep saying that after I tell you I do. You want to prove a point." "What point?" "That Dad overlooked you. That we don't appreciate you. That you're smarter than everybody thinks." The words found their places with ugly accuracy. Ruth felt Evelyn shift behind her. Dean continued, quieter now. "Maybe all of that is true. It doesn't make this land good. No. It doesn't make you 30 again. No. It doesn't give you the money to fix it. No." His anger faltered because she had refused to defend herself. Ruth lifted one of the orange flags from the ground and turned it between her fingers. "You should go. Mom, you asked Mr. Mercer properly. I'm asking you the same way. This affects Russell and me. What I do with my property does not belong to your partnership. It does when you're burning the only buyer willing to pay above agricultural value." Ruth pushed the flag back into the soil. "You divided the operation? You don't get to put it back together whenever you need my acreage." Dean stared at her, breathing through his nose. Behind them, Hal's nail gun fired once. Everyone jumped except Evelyn. Dean looked toward the sound and saw the roofers watching. Color deepened along his neck. "I hope this is worth it," he said. Ruth could have let him leave with that. Instead, she heard herself say, "So do I." The honesty stopped him. For one moment, Dean looked as tired as he had sounded on the phone. Then he turned and walked across the field to his pickup. Ruth waited until he reached the road. Evelyn came beside her. "You want me to say that was impressive?" "No." "Good, because you're shaking." Ruth looked at her hand. The orange flag trembled between her fingers. "It's cold. It's 54 degrees. Wind chill." "Of course." Hal climbed down from the roof and approached with exaggerated concentration on the yard. "We're going to need another day. Found more rot than I hoped." "How much more?" 800 in decking if the back corner doesn't surprise me." "The back corner will. It has that look." Ruth approved the additional work. Hal returned to his ladder, relieved to have a subject with numbers. Evelyn watched him go. "You want to sit in my truck?" "No." "Want coffee?" "No." "Want me to mind my business?" "Yes." "Can't." "I've leased adjacent acreage." They finished marking the boundary. Before leaving, Ruth drove to the hardware store and bought a length of chain, 2 padlocks, and a no trespassing sign. The clerk asked if she needed help carrying the chain. Ruth said no, then accepted after lifting it once. The sign went beside the lane. 1 padlock secured the north gate until Evelyn's new entrance could be installed. Ruth gave the second key to Evelyn because farm access was part of the lease. She did not give one to either son. Russell noticed. He arrived the following afternoon and knocked on the farmhouse door hard enough to shake the loose frame. "That sounded personal," Ruth said when she let him in. "You changed the lock on the gate," I added one. "Dean says you took keys out of a buyer's truck. The buyer left with them. He says you made him ask. He managed." Russell shoved both hands into his jacket pockets. "Why do you keep poking him? Your brother drove onto my land after I told him not to." "I know. He shouldn't have. But you could have handled it without embarrassing him in front of people." Ruth stepped aside so Russell could see the black tape, bare cabinets, and plaster dust. "Where would you have preferred I take him? That's not what I mean. It rarely is." He walked to the window. Outside, roof debris filled a tarp beside Hal's trailer. "How much is this costing?" "Less than a new roof, more than good weather." "Mom, 7,800, assuming no more surprises." Russell turned. "You're spending that on a house you won't live in? I'm spending it to stop water. You could let the company tear it down." Ruth's patience thinned. Did Dean send you? No. Then don't use his sentences. Russell looked down at the floor. The bank wants us to reduce the operating line before planting. By how much? He didn't say. You signed the debt. I know what I signed. Then how do you not know what the bank wants? His face changed. Ruth regretted the question before he answered. Dean handles the lender, he said. Of course he does. I handle service and parts. We divide the work. You divide information too? We can make the payment. Then make it. We will. Russell's voice rose on the last word. He looked startled by it. Ruth waited. He rubbed a hand across his mouth. I'm sorry? For shouting or for coming here to help Dean sell my farm? I didn't come to do that. Why did you come? He stared out at the field. I don't know. This time, she believed him. The roof was finished before the first warm rain. Water flowed through the repaired gutters instead of staining the kitchen ceiling. The farmhouse remained empty, but it was dry enough that Ruth brought in a folding table, 2 chairs, and a coffee maker. She ran from an extension cord Hal connected to the one reliable outlet. Evelyn installed the new gate with help from 2 of her employees. Ruth paid her half. Lime trucks crossed the higher ground only after it had firmed, and Evelyn drilled grass and alfalfa into the leased acres. The upper fields waited. Ruth spent mornings going through costs and afternoons doing the smaller jobs that multiplied whenever she finished one. She cleared chemical jugs from the second shed. She marked broken fence posts with orange paint. She hauled scrap metal into piles Thomas approved and piles he called wishful thinking. He rebuilt the Massey's hydraulic pump and replaced 2 hoses. You need rear tires before harvest, he told her. I'm not harvesting. You need rear tires before someday becomes an emergency. Put them on the list. The list is longer than the tractor, so charge it rent. She paid his invoices every Friday. By mid-April, Ruth's left knee ached each evening. She ignored it because the pain faded by breakfast. When her hands stiffened, she warmed them around coffee and began again. The west fence bothered her most. Deer had pushed through several sections, and one corner had collapsed beneath a dead limb. Evelyn did not need that fence for hay, but Ruth saw it every time she drove in. Thomas offered to help on Sunday. I can fix a fence, Ruth said. You can also make lunch. Doesn't mean I trust you with it. I'm busy Sunday. Doing what? Fixing a fence. She went Saturday instead. The morning was cool, the ground damp but firm. Ruth loaded posts, a hand driver, pliers, staples, and a roll of wire into the grain wagon after Thomas cut away the walnut sapling. The wagon tire held air for nearly an hour. It went flat halfway to the west corner. Ruth left it and carried what she could. The roll of wire dragged against her leg. By the time she reached the broken section, sweat had dampened the back of her shirt. The dead limb was heavier than it looked. She pulled once, changed her grip, and pulled again. It rolled suddenly, catching the wire beneath it. Ruth stepped backward, her boot sliding in wet grass. Her knee folded. She hit the ground on one hip, then her shoulder. The pliers flew from her hand. For several seconds she could not breathe. When air returned, it came with a noise she would have denied making. Ruth lay still and took inventory. Hip hurt, shoulder hurt, left knee burned. Nothing felt broken. She pushed herself onto one elbow. The field tilted. She lowered herself again. Above her, the sky was painfully blue. A hawk circled high over the cottonwoods. Ruth could hear Evelyn's tractor somewhere beyond the rise, steady and indifferent. She reached for her phone. Her coat pocket was empty. Ruth saw it then, lying on the grain wagon beside the lane. She laughed once because the alternative was less dignified. The tractor sound stopped. A few minutes later, it started again, louder. Evelyn's white truck appeared on the rise, followed the fence line, and braked hard 30 yards away. Evelyn jumped out and ran toward her. Ruth lifted one hand. Don't make a production. Evelyn dropped to her knees in the grass. Are you hurt? I'm resting. On wire cutters, pliers. That clears everything up. Evelyn checked Ruth's head, pupils, wrists, and ankles with brisk hands. Can you sit? I've been considering it. Together they got Ruth upright. Pain shot through her knee, and the field darkened at the edges. Evelyn caught her beneath both arms. You do not get to faint, she said. I only leased 38 acres. Ruth leaned against her, breathing hard. I wasn't fainting. You were negotiating with consciousness. I won. No, you didn't. Ruth looked toward the broken fence. The limb still lay where it had fallen, the wire trapped beneath it. Nothing she had intended to finish was finished. Evelyn followed her gaze. "Leave it," she said. "I can't." "Yes, you can." I can't keep leaving things for other people." Evelyn's grip softened but did not release her. "Then pay them," she said. "You're good at that." Ruth started to object, but Evelyn was already calling someone. "Who is that?" "Thomas." "Don't. He's closest." "I don't need Thomas." "Fine. I'll tell him to bring someone you do need." Evelyn held the phone away when Ruth reached for it. Pain shot from Ruth's knee into her thigh, forcing her hand back to the grass. "That was a poor demonstration," Evelyn said. Thomas arrived in 12 minutes. He parked beside the flat wagon, took Ruth's phone from the seat, and approached without hurrying. "You left this," he said. "I know where I left it. Then your memory's excellent." Between them, Evelyn and Thomas got Ruth into the white truck. She could bear weight, but every step produced a hot, unstable feeling beneath her kneecap. Thomas retrieved the tools and moved the Massey beneath the shed. Evelyn drove Ruth to the county clinic while he followed in his truck. "You can go home," Ruth told him through the open window. "I could. You're choosing not to irritate me. I'm getting paid. You are not billing me for this." Thomas considered. "Then I'm irritating you." The clinic found no fracture. Ruth had strained her knee, bruised her hip, and pulled something in her shoulder, whose name she forgot, before the practitioner finished saying it. She left with a knee brace, instructions against lifting, and a cane she disliked on sight. Marlene met them in the parking lot. She got out of the Buick, surveyed the brace, the cane, Evelyn's muddy jeans, and Thomas holding Ruth's coat. "You fell." "I sat unexpectedly." "On what?" "The ground." "Was it where you left it?" Evelyn covered her mouth. Ruth pointed the cane at Marlene. "You can drive me home quietly." "No. I knew that before I asked." Marlene settled Ruth in the Buick, took the clinic papers from Thomas, and thanked Evelyn with enough sincerity to embarrass everybody. Then she drove to Ruth's house and parked as if leaving had never been considered. "I don't need a nurse," Ruth said. "Excellent. I'm not qualified." Marlene brought in a small suitcase from the trunk. "You packed before you knew what happened?" "I keep an overnight bag because my friends make poor decisions in several counties." Ruth wanted to argue. Instead, she used the cane to reach the living room and lowered herself onto the couch. The movement took so long that anger could not keep pace with it. Marlene raised the footrest and covered her with a blanket. "I'm not cold," then sweat quietly. For 4 days, Ruth's world narrowed to the couch, bathroom, and kitchen table. Marlene cooked meals large enough for 5 people and ate as if apologizing to the leftovers. She moved Cal's mug only when necessary and returned it to the exact place beside the sink. Thomas repaired the west fence with one of Evelyn's employees. He submitted an invoice for labor, wire, posts, and emergency retrieval of stubborn landowner, priced at $1. Ruth mailed him a check that included the dollar. Evelyn called each evening with reports. The newly seeded hay ground had held through rain. The new gate was firm. Hal's roof did not leak. Nobody from Consolidated Prairie had returned. On the 5th morning, Russell knocked at the kitchen door. Marlene answered while Ruth sat at the table with her leg elevated on a chair. Russell saw the brace. "What happened?" "Your mother attempted farming with her whole body," Marlene said. "I fell." "Where?" "The west fence." "When?" "Saturday." "It's Thursday. The calendar continues to function." Russell looked at Marlene. "Why didn't anyone call me?" Marlene poured coffee into a mug. "I wasn't aware you'd been appointed minister of Falls." "I'm her son." "Then act familiar with her." "Marlene," Ruth said. "What?" "I put on pants before answering the door. I'm showing restraint." Russell pulled out a chair, sat, then rose again, as if sitting implied he planned to stay. "Are you all right?" "I will be." "You could have broken your hip." "I didn't. You were alone." "Yes." "What if Evelyn hadn't found you?" "I would have invented the telephone and regretted leaving it in the wagon." His fear came out as anger, but unlike Dean's, it did not tell anyone what to do. It merely stood in the kitchen, helpless and loud. Ruth softened her voice. "Sit down." He sat. Marlene placed coffee before him, then took her own mug into the living room. She left the door open. Russell looked at the legal pad on the table. "What are these numbers?" "Planting costs." "You're still planting?" "My knee isn't contagious." Who's doing the work? I'll hire custom planting. You have a tractor. I also have 70 acres worth planting and 1 knee worth keeping. Russell pulled the pad closer. Ruth had priced soybean seed, inoculant, fuel, spraying, and custom work for the upper fields. She had cut the acreage twice, first from 92 to 78, then to 68 after walking the worst slope with Evelyn. You're leaving the low 40 out, he said. Yes, and the strip north of the house. It needs cover. That's almost half the plantable ground. Plantable is a generous word. Russell studied the figures. At 68 acres, your overhead per acre is terrible. My overhead exists whether I plant badly or not. You won't make much. I may lose money. Then why plant anything? To learn what still works. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the page. Dean contracted enough seed to cover all our home acreage before the lender meeting. Why? Early discount. Do you have the cash? We have credit with the supplier. That was not the question. Russell's shoulders lifted and dropped. The dealership's carrying us through planting. The dealership has its own bills. It also has receivables. Receivables are money people promise you. Bills are money people expect. I know how it works. Ruth looked at him. He gave a tired smile. I hear it now. Hear what? Myself sounding like Dean. No, Dean would not have noticed. Russell turned the legal pad around. Your custom rate is too high. That's the best quote I got. I can plant it. Ruth did not answer. We'll finish ours first, he said. Then I can bring the planter over. How much? I'm not charging you. Then no. Mom, your fuel, your time, the planter's wear. It's 1 day. Then price 1 day. You don't have to pay me for helping. I'm not asking for help. I'm hiring work. What's the difference? One of them arrives when convenient and expects gratitude. The other arrives when agreed and sends an invoice. Russell sat back. You make everything difficult. I make terms clear. Dad helped neighbors all the time. Your father kept favors circulating like loose change. He also complained when people spent them differently than he expected. Russell laughed, then tried not to. That's true. I'll pay the local custom rate minus hauling because you're coming from 6 miles away. That still feels wrong. Work is not an apology, Russell. His face settled. Ruth tapped the page. If you want to repair what you signed, that takes longer than a day on a planter. Marlene went very still in the living room. Russell looked at the figures again. All right, say the rate. He named one below her lowest quote, but high enough to be fair. Agreed, Ruth said. He drew a rough map on the back of the page. Which field first? The Upper East. It dries 2 days before the rest. It didn't last year. Last year, the Pritchards entered from the south and compacted the headland. Used the west entrance and worked downhill. How do you know? Because water comes off the tree line here. Ruth marked the route with her pen. And because the east field always warms first unless snow piles along the hedge. Russell frowned at the map. Dad never planted it that way. He did in 1982. You remember how Dad planted in 1982? I told him how to plant it. His pen stopped. Ruth could have changed the subject. For years she had done exactly that whenever the past threatened to sound like a claim against Cal. She had let old work become family atmosphere, present everywhere, owned by no one. Russell looked up. What do you mean? Your father shattered his leg the year after we married. Walter was sick. I ran the West Place until Cal could walk well enough to take it back. Ran it how? The usual way. Badly at first. Better before I finished. Why didn't I know that? Ruth glanced toward Cal's mug by the sink. You knew I helped. That's not the same. No, did Dean know? I assume he knows what you knew. Russell pushed the map away and stood. He walked to the window, then back to the table. Dad told us he built the operation. He did. With you. Yes, but when Dean said you'd never run row crop acreage, Ruth's gaze sharpened. When did he say that? At the partnership meeting before we brought you the division. And what did you say? Russell looked down. Nothing. He had said nothing, because he had known nothing, and because not knowing had been comfortable enough. Ruth's knee throbbed beneath the brace. You weren't there, she said. You couldn't defend a history nobody gave you. That sounds like forgiveness. It isn't. He accepted that. Marlene returned to the kitchen and picked up the coffee pot. For the record, I knew. Russell stared at her. I also know where your father hid $20 from me during Frank's bachelor party, she said. Not every family fact deserves equal weight. This one did. Yes, Marlene said. It did. Russell folded the field map and put it in his jacket pocket. I'll bring the planter when the east ground's ready, he said. Knock first. At the farmhouse? At the gate, if that helps you remember. He smiled without much humor. What do I tell Dean? The truth. Which part? Ruth looked at the box of copied records, the legal pad, and her son standing awkwardly in the kitchen where his father's mug remained unclaimed. Start with the acreage, she said. See if you can manage the history later. Marlene waited until the kitchen door closed behind Russell. You enjoyed that. No, you enjoyed a small, medically acceptable portion. Ruth shifted her leg from the chair and tightened the brace. I should have told them years ago. You were busy letting Cal tell it. He didn't lie. He edited for length. That's still not lying. It is when the only thing he shortens is you. Ruth reached for the coffee pot. Marlene intercepted it and poured for her. Cal knew what I did, Ruth said. Knowing privately is cheap. He thanked me. When? Many times. Name one. Ruth could. Cal thanked her the year a hailstorm stripped half the west field, after she negotiated enough time with the bank to get them through harvest. He thanked her in their bedroom, with his forehead against her shoulder, too exhausted to lift his head. He had thanked her when she learned the dealership's accounting system, when she found an error in an equipment note, and when she spent 3 nights beside Walter's hospital bed so Cal could plant. He had thanked her where no one else could hear. Marlene saw the answer before Ruth spoke. That's what I thought, she said. Private things still count. Of course they do. They just shouldn't be the only things. Ruth drank her coffee. Marlene stayed another week, leaving only after Ruth demonstrated she could step into the shower without turning it into an emergency. She packed her suitcase, inspected the refrigerator, and placed 4 labeled containers in the freezer. You wrote Tuesday on all of these, Ruth said. I believe in Tuesday. You made enough soup for a month of Tuesdays. You're welcome. At the door, Marlene hugged her carefully and whispered, Call before you fall next time. I didn't schedule this one. Then your planning needs work. By the time Ruth could walk the West Place without the cane, Evelyn's first grass had begun to show. It came up thin near the old channel and thick along the rise. 2 hard rains washed seed from one corner and left a fan of silt across the lower edge. Evelyn crouched beside the bare patch. I'll reseed. Will it hold? Eventually. That's an expensive word. Most useful words are. The alfalfa emerged more evenly, though weeds raced it toward daylight. Evelyn sprayed once and refused to spray again until she saw what survived. Horse people buy hay by appearance, she said. The horse does not care if a stem looks rustic. The owner cares deeply. Ruth looked across the green haze. What do you call rustic hay? Cattle feed. Russell called on a warm evening to say he would bring the planter the next morning. He named an arrival time of 8 and appeared at 7:45, pulling a 12-row planter behind one of the partnership's larger tractors. He stopped at the locked gate, climbed down, and knocked on the metal sign. Ruth watched from the farmhouse porch. You said knock, he called. I heard you. Planning to let me in? I'm enjoying the improvement. She unlocked the gate. Russell handed her a 1-page work order from the dealership. It listed the agreed custom rate, fuel, and no hauling charge. At the bottom, he had written payment due after completion. Clear enough? He asked. Almost professional. Dean made the form. Then don't tell him I said that. Russell unfolded the field map. Ground's dry enough. Rain comes tomorrow night. If the monitor behaves, I can finish by supper. And if it doesn't, it'll behave. The monitor did not behave. After the first pass, it reported that row 7 was planting 3 times the population of the other rows. Russell stopped, climbed down, and checked the seed tube. Nothing was blocked. He switched sensors, checked wiring, cleaned a connector, and began again. The monitor screamed before the planter traveled 50 feet. Ruth stood at the edge of the field with her cane, which she had brought only because the ground was uneven, and not because anyone had asked. How long has it done this? She called. Today. That wasn't my question. Russell climbed from the cab. It flickered while we were finishing the south quarter. Did you repair it? I cleaned it. So did I this morning. I remain 68. He took out his phone. I'll call the shop. Thomas arrived first, though nobody admitted calling him. He parked beside the planter, opened the monitor housing, and stared at the wiring. Mouse, he said. There are no mice in the tractor, Russell said. Thomas held up a chewed wire. That could have happened in storage. It happened near a mouse. Ruth went to the farmhouse for coffee while the men argued about voltage. When she returned, Dean's pickup was beside Thomas's truck. Dean stood on the planter frame, holding a replacement harness. He had brought 3 paper sacks from the diner and set them on the tractor step. Ruth approached slowly. Dean glanced at her brace. Russell said you strained your knee. Russell says many things now. He should have called me. To repair it, to tell me. Ruth looked at the harness. You had the part. We stock it. Thomas said it should have been replaced last winter. Dean's face tightened. Thomas thinks every part should be replaced 6 months before we sell it. Usually because you call it preventive maintenance after it breaks. Thomas shouted from beneath the tractor. I can hear both of you. Dean leaned into the housing and connected the harness. We had other expenses. Ruth heard the opening and let it pass. Asking about the partnership's finances in front of Russell and Thomas would turn concern into a weapon. Dean climbed down. Turkey or ham? What? The sandwiches. I can see how you run the dealership. Excellent presentation. Turkey or ham, Mom? Turkey. He handed her a paper sack. They ate beside the shed on overturned buckets. Thomas took his sandwich to his truck, claiming he preferred lunch without family history. Russell sat on the tractor step, grease on his forearm. Dean remained standing until Ruth pointed to an empty bucket. You'll digest better, she said. That's not science. It was good enough when you were 10. He sat. For a while, they talked only about the planting. Russell wanted to increase the seed population where the soil looked strongest. Ruth wanted it consistent until she had 1 season of her own yield data. Dean agreed with Ruth, which annoyed Russell more than disagreement would have. You're planting too few acres, Dean said. I'm planting the acres I chose. You could put soybeans on another 20 west of the rise. And leave ruts through Evelyn's hay every time I access them. Use the south lane. It stays wet. In a normal spring, it's fine. Name one. Dean unwrapped the second half of his sandwich and did not answer. Ruth watched him brush crumbs from his jeans. He had Cal's habit of eating the crust first, saving the soft center as if it were dessert. Russell told me what you said, he said. About the field? About running this place. Russell focused on his sandwich. Ruth folded her paper sack. I wondered how far he'd get. He said you managed it after Dad's accident. I did. For 1 season. 11 months. Grandpa was still here, mostly in bed. Dad was here, mostly in a cast. Dean looked across the yard toward the old house. Dad said you kept the books. I kept those too. Why didn't he ever say you ran it? Ruth could not tell whether the question accused her, Cal, or the dead man's entire arrangement of memory. He said I got them through that year. That's not the same. No, she said. Russell made a soft sound that might have meant agreement. Dean's gaze moved to him. You planning to make a habit of discussing private partnership meetings? It was about her. It was about dividing assets. While we were deciding what she could manage, Ruth could feel the conversation tilting toward the fight her sons had avoided in her kitchen. Finish eating, she said. Dean ignored her. You agreed with the division. I agreed because I thought she'd sell. So did I. She didn't. I noticed. And now we deal with it. Dean stood. I am dealing with it. I brought the harness. The smallness of the sentence quieted all 3 of them. Dean looked down at the bucket, embarrassed by what he had revealed. He had brought the part because Russell needed it. Because the partnership needed the planter back eventually. Because Ruth was his mother, and a field waiting for seed was one language they all understood. Ruth held out her empty paper sack. Trash? She asked. Dean took it. You could say thank you. I was getting there. He gathered the other sacks and carried them to his pickup. The new harness worked. Russell completed the east field before moving to the upper north ground. Ruth rode in the jump seat for 2 passes, her braced leg angled awkwardly beside the console. The tractor cab smelled of dust, vinyl, and the ham sandwich Russell had not finished. At the far end, he lifted the planter too late and left a short double-planted strip. Your father did that, Ruth said. Dad blamed the hydraulics. Your father blamed machines the way some men blame weather, frequently and with spiritual conviction. Russell grinned. On the next pass, he lifted at exactly the right place. Dean returned near 5, no longer wearing his dealership jacket. He stood beside Ruth at the field edge while Russell finished the last rows. You really remember planning this in '82? He asked. I remember everything about that year. I was born in '83. Yes. He watched the planter turn. Were you going to keep farming? The question caught her. I assumed I would. What happened? Your father got better. Walter got worse. Then you arrived, then Russell, then the dealership, then 40 years. Dean pushed a stone into the dirt with his boot. That makes it sound like we took it. No, it makes it sound like life kept asking, and I kept answering. Russell raised the planter and drove toward them. 68 acres lay behind him in straight, freshly closed rows. Dean looked at Ruth. I still think you should sell. I know, but the rows look good. They're rows, they're straight. It was not an apology, it was not enough. Ruth accepted it anyway. Rain arrived after midnight, steady and hard. Ruth lay awake listening to water strike her bedroom window, thinking about seed beneath cold soil and the lower field already filling. At dawn, she drove west. Water spread across the bottom, silver under the dark sky. It moved into the grass strip and slowed where no fresh furrows pulled it downhill. Above the rise, the planted ground held. Near the farmhouse, the first orange flag Ruth and Evelyn had set leaned in the rain but remained standing. Ruth straightened it with her cane. The beans emerged in crooked green lines 10 days later. Some rows came thick and even. Others showed gaps where the cold rain had crusted the soil. Near the eastern boundary, water had pooled over half an acre and left seedlings yellow and weak. Russell walked the field with Ruth, digging with a pocket knife wherever the stand looked thin. You could replant this section, he said. For half an acre? And the strip below it. That's another 3/4. Seed company might replace the seed. The planter won't replace the fuel or your time. Russell pushed soil over the exposed seed. Dad always said, a thin stand bothers you all season. Your father hated empty spaces. That's how we ended up with 6 lamps in the living room. What are you going to do? Watch it for a week. What if it doesn't improve? Then I'll watch it disappoint me for longer. The weak plants never matched the rest, but enough survived that Ruth left them. She marked the area on her map and wrote the decision beside it. Not every imperfection required money. The farmhouse well pump required money. It failed the first morning. Ruth tried to run water after the split pipes were replaced. The motor hummed, coughed up a stream the color of tea, and stopped. The well contractor offered a new pump with a warranty. Ruth bought a used one from a neighbor who had converted his property to county water. Thomas inspected it in the shed. It's old, he said. It's younger than the one that failed. So am I. Doesn't mean you should install me in a well. It ran when they removed it. Everybody runs once. The used pump lasted 19 days. It failed while Ruth had soap on both hands and no water in the kitchen. She stood at the sink, looking at the dry faucet, until Evelyn came through the door, carrying a stack of invoices. You look angry, Evelyn said. I'm conserving water. Evelyn drove her to the hardware store, with Ruth holding both soapy hands above her lap. The next morning, Ruth ordered the new pump she should have bought first. The mistake cost her $900 between the used pump, installation, removal, and the second service call. Thomas did not say he had warned her. His silence was more irritating than words. You're enjoying this, Ruth said, as he helped the contractor lower the replacement. Deeply. Say it. I don't work on wells. Say you told me. I wrote it on the inspection. That isn't saying it. Thomas adjusted the rope around the pump housing. I have no need to humiliate a woman standing over a hole containing $900. Evelyn laughed from the porch. The 3 of them ate lunch beneath the equipment shed after the water ran clear. Ruth had started keeping sandwich meat and mustard in the farmhouse refrigerator, though the rest of the building remained mostly empty. A folding table stood beneath the kitchen window. 2 second-hand bookcases held farm records, tools, and canned soup. Evelyn spread her invoices across the lunch table. I need help, she said. Ruth took a bite of turkey. With? These. That is paper. It breeds in my truck. The invoices came from seed dealers, fuel suppliers, repair shops, and 3 horse farms that paid on different schedules. Evelyn tracked most of it in a notebook stained with coffee and rain. 2 customers owed her money from the previous fall. She owed Thomas for repairs performed before Christmas. Thomas glanced at the page. I've noticed. You'll get paid Friday. You said that Tuesday. I didn't specify the week. Ruth examined the notebook. How do you know which cutting paid for itself? The account balance stops scaring me. That is not accounting. It's emotional accounting. It's excellent for producing emotions. Evelyn wanted Ruth to organize the records and create a system simple enough to maintain from her truck. Ruth offered 3 afternoons in exchange for labor, repairing the remaining west fence and clearing the shed. No, Evelyn said. I'll pay you. I don't want to be paid. You made Thomas charge you. I made him perform an inspection. This is an inspection of my financial character. Then it will take longer. They settled on a trade only after assigning dollar values to both sides. Evelyn complained that Ruth could turn accepting help into a tax audit. Ruth replied that Evelyn could turn paying a bill into historical fiction. By June, the west shed had a usable workbench and enough open floor for the Massey. The farmhouse kitchen held labeled folders for Evelyn's customers. Thomas began leaving parts invoices in a tray near the coffee maker, sometimes for Evelyn, sometimes for Ruth, once for a man neither recognized. Ruth called him. Who is Gerald? Blue Ford. That does not answer the question. He'll come by. I am not running your billing office. You have a tray. Gerald came by. The first hay cutting happened beneath a week of clear forecasts. Evelyn mowed on Monday, tedded on Tuesday, and planned to bale Thursday morning. Rain arrived Wednesday night. Ruth woke to it, hitting her bedroom window, and knew before Evelyn called. Don't say anything encouraging, Evelyn said. I wasn't going to. Don't say anything about forecasts. I wasn't going to. Don't tell me hay gets rained on. How are you feeling about silence? Evelyn hung up. The hay dried eventually, but the color faded and several bales heated enough that Evelyn spread them apart beneath the shed to cool. The horse farms refused the cutting. She sold most of it as cattle feed for nearly 40% less than expected. At the folding table, Evelyn entered the loss into the system Ruth had made. I dislike knowing the exact number, she said. You preferred fear without detail? I preferred room for optimism. Optimism needs numbers too. No, hope needs numbers. Optimism needs poor record keeping. Ruth printed a summary for her. Despite the lost cutting, Evelyn paid the first lease installment on time. Ruth used part of it for lime on the upper field and placed the rest in the farm account. The account looked small after every deposit and smaller after every check. Summer hardened the ground. The low 40, which had held spring water, dried into rough grass and sedge. Weeds rose chest-high in places. Dean drove past twice while Ruth and Thomas were cutting thistles along the roadside. He did not stop. The soybeans closed their rows late. Their color remained uneven where potassium was lowest. Ruth walked them every few days, first with the cane and later without it. She learned what age had changed. Uneven ground demanded attention. Heat arrived faster in her body. A task that once fit between breakfast and lunch now occupied the day. She also learned what had not changed. Leaves turned their undersides before a storm. Deer entered near the broken willow, even after the fence was fixed. Men selling crop treatment still used the phrase "everybody's doing it" when they could not explain the return. Ruth declined 2 foliar products and bought one treatment she later suspected had done nothing. She wrote that down too. Dean visited once in July. He brought no buyers. He stood at the edge of the soybean field, hands on his hips. Stan looks thin. It is. We sprayed ours last week. With what? He named a product Ruth had rejected. See a response? Too early. How much? Dean told her. She calculated the total across the home acreage and kept her expression still. You planting wheat after these? He asked. Cover crop on part. Maybe wheat next year. You're moving slow. I'm 68. That isn't what I meant. I know. He looked toward Evelyn's hay. The second cutting lay in neat windrows under a hot, clear sky. Her rent can't be much. It covers what we agreed it would cover. You'd make 3 times as much leasing row crop. In a good year. Most years aren't disasters. Most disasters introduce themselves as ordinary years. Dean shoved his hands into his pockets. His jeans hung looser than they had in spring. How's the dealership? Ruth asked. Busy. Busy and profitable aren't the same. We're fine. She let the silence wait. Dean filled it with nothing. At harvest, Russell arrived with the combine they had kept, a machine newer and far more valuable than the burned red one Ruth sold. He presented another work order and refused to begin until she signed it. You're learning, she said. I'm protecting myself from management. The 68 acres took most of a day. Yields ranged from 36 bushels near the wet strip to 51 on the east rise. The average was 44, below the county's better ground and above Thomas's most pessimistic guess. Ruth rode one round in the cab. The field opened ahead of them, plants drawn into the header, beans rattling against metal. Behind them, the stubble lay clean and pale. Russell watched the yield monitor. 48 here. It won't hold. Could. It drops near the channel. It dropped to 42. How did you know? The soil changes color 50 yards back. He glanced at her. Dad watched the monitor. Your father liked numbers that moved. At the elevator, moisture dockage was modest. The market price had weakened since spring. Ruth sold enough to cover immediate expenses and stored the rest under a paid arrangement rather than gambling on a dramatic rise. When every check was written, including Russell's, the first season showed a loss. Not a ruinous one. Not a number that required selling land or borrowing against the house, but a loss all the same. Ruth sat at the farmhouse table with the yellow pad. Evelyn's lease payment, soybean receipts, roof work, pump disaster, taxes, insurance, lime, seed, custom rates, and repairs arranged in columns. Thomas came in carrying a box of hydraulic fittings. Well, he asked. I lost money. How much? She told him. He whistled. That's not supportive. It's less than I expected. That's worse. He put the box on the workbench. You planning to quit? Ruth looked through the taped kitchen window. Outside, the harvested field showed every dip and thin place. Evelyn's third cutting had come off clean. Grass along the low ground bent in the wind, holding soil where bare rows had once washed. I'm planning to stop buying used pumps, she said. Thomas poured himself coffee. That's growth. The door opened, and Russell entered with Ruth's check in his hand. You overpaid me, he said. No. The job took less fuel than the work order estimated. Then send a corrected invoice. I can tear up the check and write one. You can deposit that check and return the difference. Russell looked at Thomas. Is she like this with you? Worse. I owe her $1. Russell placed the check on the table instead of pocketing it. Ruth noticed his fingernails were black with grease, though harvest repairs were usually handled by dealership employees. What broke? She asked. Nothing. Your hands say something broke. He curled his fingers. The home combine needs a new feeder chain, he said. Dean wants to run the old one another week. Will it last? No. Does he know? Russell looked toward the window. He knows, he said. He just doesn't know what to do about it. Ruth glanced at her own loss written in careful ink. For the first time, it did not look like the most dangerous number in the room. Ruth closed the yellow pad. How much is the chain? Russell named a figure. And what does a breakdown cost? Depends what else it takes with it. Then replace it. We don't have it sitting on a shelf. Order it. Dean already decided. Your name is on half the operation. Russell's expression hardened. You think I don't know that? I think you know it whenever your brother needs your signature. Thomas lifted his coffee. I can take my fittings elsewhere. No, Ruth and Russell said together. Thomas sat back down. Russell picked up the check. I'll order the chain. Because I told you? Because you're right. Those aren't the same. They can be today. The feeder chain arrived too late. The old one broke with 80 acres left to harvest, damaging a sprocket and bending a guard. Russell lost 2 days locating parts and another day installing them. Rain followed. The remaining corn came out wetter and cost more to dry. Ruth knew because Russell told her. Dean did not mention it when he came to Thanksgiving dinner. Ruth cooked the turkey in the same roasting pan she had used throughout her marriage. Cal had always carved badly, beginning at whichever side offered the most skin. That year, Dean brought an electric carving knife in its original box. Dad's finally dead enough for you to replace his method? Russell asked. Dean plugged it in. Dad's method was vandalism. The knife made a mechanical buzzing sound against the breastbone. Marlene covered both ears. This is how surgeons cut drywall, she said. Dinner remained almost pleasant. Dean complimented the dressing. Russell washed dishes without being asked. Marlene described Frank's latest online photograph from Arizona, in which he wore linen pants and held a bar of soap named Desert Forgiveness. At the table, the empty place where Cal had sat seemed to expand and contract, depending on who looked toward it. Dean noticed Ruth's cane leaning by the pantry. Still using that? On uneven ground. You should hire somebody to manage the farm. I have. Me. I mean daily work. That would still be me. He opened his mouth, then reached for more dressing instead. After pie, the men went into the garage to look at a noise in Dean's pickup. Ruth stood at the sink while Marlene dried. "They behaved," Marlene said. "They're tired. Same effect at our age." Through the window, Ruth could see Dean holding a flashlight while Russell leaned beneath the hood. They worked well together when the problem had bolts. The West Farm entered winter without anything dramatic happening. Ruth planted cereal rye on the most exposed upper ground and left the low acreage covered in rough grass. The rye came up green before the first snow. Evelyn's hay went dormant with enough growth to protect the soil. Ruth used cold weeks to decide what the second season could afford. She did not try to win back her first-year loss in one crop. She contracted a smaller acreage of soybeans, planned oats on part of the rise, and budgeted for drainage only around the farmhouse lane. The larger system remained broken because the larger system did not need to be restored. Every plan looked insufficient beside the old maps, showing nearly all the acreage planted. That began to feel like reassurance. The anniversary of Cal's stroke arrived as sleet. Ruth drove to the West farmhouse, made coffee, and sat alone at the folding table while ice clicked against the windows. She had brought Cal's mug. World's okayest farmer faced her from the other side of the table. The crack near the handle had darkened with coffee, a thin brown line that no amount of washing removed. "You'd hate the oats," she told him. The empty chair offered no argument. "I sold the combine. Nothing. The roof cost more than I said it would. Still nothing. I'm not selling." That was the sentence she had come to say. Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug and cried until the coffee cooled. Then she washed the cup in water from the expensive new pump and placed it in the farmhouse cabinet. She left it there. In spring, Tomas built shelves above the workbench. Evelyn filled one with twine and complained when he labeled the others. "Ruth's making you organized," she said. "I'm protecting my property from yours. You left 3 carburetors on my invoices last month. They were alphabetized. By what? Regret." Marlene began coming every Wednesday, usually with lunch and always with an opinion. She handled supply pickups when Ruth's knees swelled, though she refused to call it handling supply pickups. "I'm going to town," she said. "Your fertilizer happens to be there." Evelyn completed the west fence with Ruth's traded hours fully accounted for. Then she continued helping after the balance reached 0. Ruth tried to create a new ledger entry. Evelyn took the notebook away. "You will accept one favor. I accept favors. Name one." "I let Marlene criticize my turkey. That's public service." The first oat crop came up uneven, pale where the soil needed more correction. Ruth considered additional fertilizer, calculated the likely return, and decided against it. The yield at harvest was ordinary. She sold it to a local feed mill for enough to cover seed, custom work, and part of the lime. The soybeans did better than the first year, not because Ruth had discovered a secret, but because the rain arrived when it should. Evelyn's hay produced 3 clean cuttings. Her lease payment and Ruth's crop income covered the farm's operating expenses, taxes, insurance, and repairs, with a little left over. The remaining first-year loss still existed. The roof money had not grown back. The farmhouse still needed windows, siding, and a furnace. But no check had to be written from Ruth's personal account after midsummer. She marked that day on the yellow pad. When Tomas arrived, she showed him the balance. "You made money? I stopped losing it. Same thing after a certain age. No, it isn't. Close enough to buy lunch?" Ruth bought lunch. Dean's home operation produced more grain in a single week than Ruth did all season. Trucks moved in and out of the home place from dawn until after dark. From the county road, the bins and machine sheds looked busy enough to confirm every decision he had made. At the dealership, the showroom changed. The newer used tractors disappeared first. Then 2 demonstration mowers were sold before spring display season. The parts shelves remained stocked, but the delivery truck came less often. Dean called it reducing inventory. Thomas called it selling the furniture to heat the house. Russell stopped joking about either description. He came to the West Farm one afternoon to pick up a hydraulic cylinder Thomas had rebuilt. Ruth found him in the shed, turning the part over in his hands. "You could have bought new," she said. "Rebuilt is fine. Dean used to say downtime cost more than parts. Dean says lots of things." Russell put the cylinder in his truck. Ruth waited. He leaned against the tailgate. "We're selling the 40 by the county line. The 40 acres were not connected to the home place. Cal had bought them when soybeans were high, mostly because a neighbor told him he could not afford them. Will it cover the operating shortfall? Ruth asked. Some. Who's buying? Pritchard's. They'll pay fair, less than Dad paid. Your father paid for the pleasure of winning. Russell looked toward the farmhouse. Dean says you think we're failing. I think you're selling land. That's not the same. No. He waited as if she would add something. She did not. By the second soybean harvest, Russell had begun doing most machinery repairs himself. The dealership's best mechanic left for a larger operation that offered regular hours and health insurance Dean said he could no longer match. Thomas picked up occasional work, but refused a permanent arrangement. I like Dean, he told Ruth. You do? In controlled doses, like solvent. The home operation planted every available acre again. Dean added rented ground west of town because the lease price looked favorable and he believed volume would spread their costs. Ruth asked Russell whether they had enough machinery to handle it. We do if nothing breaks. You've adopted his favorite condition. Nothing major, he amended. The weather stayed dry through early harvest. Ruth's beans came off first. Her average improved by 6 bushels, helped by the east rise and hurt by the same wet strip. She paid every invoice and moved the remaining money into the farm account. The home place began corn the next morning. 4 days later, the main tractor's transmission failed. Ruth heard about it from Thomas, who heard from the parts supplier, who had asked whether he would guarantee overnight freight. Did you? Ruth asked. No. Can it be repaired? Everything can be repaired if you stop caring what it costs. What will Dean do? Make Russell decide. Ruth called neither son. The following evening, headlights crossed the west yard after sunset. Ruth was at the folding table entering Evelyn's final hay invoices. Someone knocked on the farmhouse door. Russell stood outside, hat in both hands. His face was gray with dust. A dark smear ran from his temple to his jaw. What happened? Ruth asked. Nobody's hurt. That was not my question. The transmission housing cracked. We found a used assembly in Iowa, but it won't be here for at least 5 days. Where's the backup tractor? On the grain cart. Its hydraulics are overheating. Dean said you had enough machinery. I know what Dean said. Ruth stepped aside. Russell entered but remained near the door. Coffee? No. Food? No. Then say it. He looked past her toward Cal's mug in the cabinet. Ruth had not noticed the door was open. We need the Massey, he said. Ruth waited. To pull one of the smaller wagons, he continued. Just between the north fields and the bins. We can keep the bigger tractor on the cart and free the truck for hauling. The rear tires are still worn. I know. Thomas has 2 coming, but they won't be here until Monday. When do you want it? Tonight. Ruth closed Evelyn's invoice book. You drove here after dark to borrow a tractor with bad tires because your operation has 1 tractor broken, another overheating, and a used transmission coming from Iowa. Russell rubbed both hands over his face. Yes. What aren't you telling me? Nothing. Then you learned that answer from Dean, too. He turned toward the door. Ruth did not stop him. His hand reached the knob, stayed there, then fell. When we divided the farm, he said, still facing away, Dean showed me a cash flow plan. Ruth waited. It included the West Place selling to Consolidated. That is not news. It included more than the sale. He turned. Shame had changed his face more than dust. He had you putting part of the money back into the operation, Russell said, as a family loan. He counted it before we ever asked you. Ruth felt the room become very quiet. How much? $250,000. I never offered that. I know. You signed the division believing I would. Russell's eyes dropped. I believed once you had the cash, he said. You wouldn't let us fail. Ruth looked at Russell's face and understood how a man could tell the truth while still hoping to escape it. You believed I would sell my land and hand you $250,000. Alone. Did anyone ask me? No. Did anyone discuss interest, repayment, security? No. Then it wasn't a loan. It was a number Dean put in a blank space because he expected me to fill it. Russell sank into one of the folding chairs. He said you'd have more cash than you needed. The sentence struck so cleanly that Ruth almost admired it. More than I needed. I'm telling you what he said. You agreed. I didn't think of it like that. How did you think of it? That we'd keep the operation? You'd be protected. Everybody would still have what Dad built. What would I have? The sale money. Minus $250,000. It was supposed to come back. From an operation that already needed it to survive. Russell pressed his palms against his eyes. I know how it sounds. It sounds exactly like what it was. We were scared. So was I. Dean said if we split everything equally, the home place would have to sell. The dealership might close. You'd get cash, but there'd be no Bell operation left. And that possibility frightened you more than cheating me. We didn't cheat you. Ruth's chair scraped backward. Russell lifted his head. You gave me land you called worthless because you believed I would sell it, she said. Then you counted part of the money before I received it. You sat at my kitchen table, watched your brother call it the safest arrangement for me, and said almost nothing. I told him it wasn't fair, where I couldn't hear you. I didn't know what else to do. You could have disagreed where it cost you something. His mouth opened. Ruth did not let him interrupt. You keep offering me your intentions as if they are work. You meant to object. You meant to protect me. You never wanted to hurt me. Russell, cowardice performed politely still leaves the same bruise. He recoiled. Ruth's hands were shaking again. She placed them flat on the table, furious at her body for revealing what her voice had not. Russell stood. I came here and told you, after the tractor broke. Yes. The word filled the farmhouse. He could have lied. He could have claimed the timing was coincidence or conscience. Instead, he stood beneath the weak kitchen light and allowed the ugliest fact to remain his. Ruth sat down. Does the lender's plan include my money? No. It was Dean's internal projection. He showed me before we signed the division. When you refused the sale, he called it delayed capital and kept moving it forward. For 2 years. Yes. What has he spent based on it? Not the money itself. We don't have it, but we kept acreage we should have dropped, bought inputs on extended terms, delayed maintenance. He thought once you saw the farm losing money, you'd reconsider. Did you? For a while. And now... Russell looked through the window toward the dark shed. Now I'm asking to borrow the tractor from the farm nobody could use. Ruth let the silence sit between them. The Massey does not leave tonight, she said. His face fell. Mom, we have corn standing. It has bad rear tires. I won't have you pulling loaded wagons after dark. We can go slow. No, rain's coming Sunday, then higher hauling. We can't afford the rate. You cannot afford an overturn either. Russell gripped the chair back. So that's it? No. Thomas installs the tires Monday. After that, you can rent the Massey at the county rate. Rent. Yes. From my mother, from Bell West Farm. He laughed without humor. Dean will love that. You will also tell him tonight that my land and money are not part of any future plan. I can tell him. You will show me the plan. His expression changed. Not because I'm investing, Ruth said. Because you use my name in it. Dean won't agree. Then no tractor. Russell paced to the sink and back. You're asking me to choose between you. No. I'm asking you to stop letting Dean tell you every choice has only 2 sides. Headlights swept across the farmhouse wall. A pickup stopped outside. Dean entered after one hard knock. You found him? He said. I wasn't lost, Russell replied. Dean looked between them. What did you tell her? The truth. Which truth? The West sale. The family loan. All of it. Dean shut the door carefully. That projection was preliminary. You carried it for 2 years, Ruth said. It was one scenario. You built decisions around it. We made adjustments. You planted rented acres this spring at a favorable rate. You sold the county line 40. That reduced debt. And you still cannot repair a tractor. Dean removed his cap and slapped dust from it against his leg. This is why I didn't bring it to you. You see one bad week and decide the whole operation is incompetent. I see my name attached to money I never offered. It was always conditional, on my obedience, on a sale that made sense, for you, for everyone. You would have had over $1 million in cash even after the loan. Russell stared at him. You told me she'd clear less. The first estimate was conservative. You had a higher offer? A revised range? From Mercer? Dean's jaw tightened. Ruth watched the brothers look at each other. Russell had spent years accepting Dean's numbers because numbers appeared cleaner than motives. Now, every figure seemed to acquire a shadow. Dean turned to Ruth. You would have been secured. By what? The home acreage. Already securing your operating line? It has equity. So does my farm. That is why you want it. Dean put his cap back on. We came for the tractor. You can rent it Monday after the tires are replaced. We need it tonight. It isn't safe. I've driven worse. And that made it better? Dad would lend it. Dad kept machines until they caught fire. Dean's eyes flicked toward the empty combine space. Russell said, "We hire Carter for the weekend. That's $6,000. It's less than a rollover." Dean rounded on him. "You come here for help and let her charge us rent? I came here because you said she owed us." "I never said owed. You said she'd do it because family mattered to her. It should." Ruth felt the words, but Russell answered first. "Family mattered when we needed her sale money," he said. "It didn't matter when we divided the ground." Dean stared at him. The fight did not become loud. That made it worse. Each brother knew the other's weak structures too well. Dean accused Russell of agreeing to every expansion until it became uncomfortable. Russell accused Dean of treating caution as betrayal. Dean reminded him who found the financing that kept the dealership open after Cal's last bad year. Russell reminded Dean whose name guaranteed half of it. Ruth listened until both began using Cal as evidence. "Stop," she said. They did. "Your father made mistakes," Ruth said. "He also died before he could help clean them up. You may miss him without making him responsible for what you chose afterward." Dean looked away. "The tractor is available Monday under safe terms," she continued. "That is what I'm offering, nothing else." Dean opened the door. "Keep it." Russell followed him outside. For several minutes, neither truck moved. Then Dean's pulled away alone. Russell returned to the farmhouse. "I'll hire Carter," he said. Ruth nodded. "I'll bring you the cash flow sheets tomorrow." "Knock." His mouth twitched. "I will." Carter's crew hauled through the weekend. Rain arrived late enough that most of the standing corn came in, though the custom bill consumed money Dean had intended for fertilizer deposits. On Monday, Tomas installed the Massey's new tires. The partnership rented it for 9 days, and Ruth issued an invoice. Dean paid it 31 days later. Russell brought the projections as promised. He and Ruth reviewed them at the folding table while Cal's mug watched from the cabinet. The numbers were worse than Ruth expected. The operation was not beyond recovery, but recovery required fewer acres, sold equipment, and a reduction in dealership overhead. It required admitting that size had become a liability. Dean rejected most of the recommendations. Russell stopped signing new obligations he had not read. That winter, he sold 12 wooded acres he owned near the river, ground he used for hunting and had once planned to keep forever. The sale covered his portion of the most urgent operating shortfall and allowed him to release one personal guarantee. Ruth did not praise him. He had not performed a noble sacrifice. He had paid a bill attached to his own choices. Still, when he came to the farmhouse afterward, she made 2 sandwiches instead of 1. Dean gave up the rented acreage west of town. He sold 1 large planter and contracted part of the next season's work. The dealership reduced its showroom and focused on repairs and parts, though the brothers continued arguing over whether to sell it entirely. Russell began taking repair jobs under his own name on evenings and Saturdays. Thomas let him use one bay at the shop for an hourly rate. "No family discount?" Russell asked. "You're not my family," Thomas said. "Friend discount?" "Not yet." By the 3rd spring, the West Farms routines no longer felt temporary. Evelyn entered the final 2 years of her lease with dense hay established across the rise. Ruth planted fewer acres again, rotating soybeans with oats and a strip of winter wheat. The low 40 remained grass and wet meadow. Thomas mowed thistles before they seeded. Marlene handled deliveries and kept canned soup in the farmhouse cabinet. Russell performed custom work under written terms and knocked even when the doors stood open. Ruth's farm account carried enough from the previous season to cover spring costs without her personal savings. Solvent was not wealthy. It was simply the ability to meet the next bill without offering a piece of herself. Then the rain began. It fell for 4 days, stopped for 1, and returned harder. Ditches filled, creeks left their banks. Fields across the county shone like dull metal. At the West Farm, water spread through the low grass, slowing before it reached the planted rise. The old channel reappeared as a darker curve beneath the water. Grass roots held the soil. The new northwest gate remained accessible, allowing Evelyn to move equipment without crossing the flooded lane. Ruth walked the edge in rubber boots, using her cane for balance. Thomas stood beside her beneath an umbrella, too small for either of them. "You planned this?" he asked. "I stopped preventing it." Less impressive, more affordable. The upper fields were wet but intact. Across the road and east toward the home place, water stood between young corn rows. Dean had reduced acreage, but the remaining ground still included low fields Cal had forced into production years earlier. Tile lines backed up. One culvert washed out. The spring planting bill remained due whether the crop survived or not. Russell came to the west, shed soaked to the skin. "We need the small pump," he said. "The new one?" "The portable trash pump Thomas left here." Thomas handed him the key to the storage cabinet. "It won't save a field." "I know. We're trying to keep water out of the electrical room by the bins." They loaded the pump without debate. Ruth sent coffee and dry towels. She did not send money. The rain stopped the following afternoon. Sun appeared over fields that could not absorb it. From the west rise, Ruth watched geese settle on the flooded meadow. No current pulled at the planted ground. The farm had not defeated the storm. It had given the water somewhere to go. A dark pickup turned into the lane. Dean parked outside the shed and sat behind the wheel for a long time. No buyer followed him. No folder rested on the dashboard. When he finally climbed out, he carried his cap in one hand. Ruth waited beneath the roof edge. Dean crossed the yard, boots sinking slightly with each step. "I need to ask you something," he said. Ruth looked past him toward the water lying quietly in the grass. "I know," she replied. Dean looked toward the lower meadow. "Mercer came back. I told him not to. He came to me. That's allowed. They increased the offer for the home place." Ruth waited. Dean rolled the cap between his hands. Without it, his hair looked thinner than she remembered. Rain had dried in streaks on his jacket. "They'll clear the operating debt," he said. "All of it. We could settle the dealership line too, depending on inventory when we close. What would you keep?" "The house lot. The main shop, maybe." "They don't care about that. And the bins? They'd buy them. The fields? All of them." Ruth looked toward the home place, though the rise blocked it from view. Cal had built the first grain bin himself, with 3 neighbors and a rented crane that frightened all 4 men. The bin leaned slightly north. Dean used to joke that it was trying to leave. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked. Dean's grip tightened on his cap. "They won't do it without the west acreage." "No. You haven't heard the number. I heard the condition. They're offering more than this farm will earn in your lifetime. That is likely true. It's enough that you wouldn't have to worry about money again." "I worry professionally." "Mom? No?" He paced to the end of the shed, then turned. "Look at the field. You can't plant half of it. I don't intend to. You've put 3 years into proving you can keep it. Fine, you proved it. Is that what you think I was proving?" "I don't know what else this is." Ruth rested both hands on the cane. "That has always been the problem." Dean's face reddened. "What do you want me to say? That we underestimated you?" "We did. That Dad took credit you deserved?" "Apparently he did." "That I should never have brought Mercer out here?" "I shouldn't have. None of that changes the offer." "No. Then why punish everybody over it? Refusing to sell you something is not punishment. It is when the refusal takes down the rest of the operation. The operation was in trouble before this land became mine. We could still save it. With hog buildings and manure pits where your father grew corn." "He grew debt too." The answer surprised her. Dean looked away, jaw working. "Sentiment doesn't make payments. Neither does acreage that loses money. I know that now." The words were so quiet, Ruth almost missed them. Water moved through the meadow in shallow, braided lines. 3 years earlier, the same rain would have crossed furrows and carried soil toward the cottonwoods. Now the grass bent beneath it and rose again. Dean walked to the shed opening. "Dad wanted the home place kept together," he said. "Your father wanted anything he loved to remain exactly where he left it. You know what I mean." "Yes." "He would want you to help us save the family farm." There it was at last. Not anger, not arithmetic, but the old family word stretched over a demand. Ruth looked at her son's wet boots, his work-reddened hands, and the deep lines beside his mouth. Dean had spent 3 years trying to preserve a shape that had already failed. He had hurt her doing it. He had frightened Russell, exhausted himself, and treated land as if surrendering 1 acre meant admitting Cal had died. Ruth could understand him without obeying him. "I already saved the part you gave me," she said. Dean closed his eyes. When he opened them, the fight had gone out of his face. "Then we're done." "No." He gave a tired laugh. "You just said no?" "To Mercer. What else is there?" The 14-acre strip along my east boundary. Dean frowned. What about it? It drains toward the west meadow. It's awkward for your larger equipment, and the access costs you time every pass. It's still productive. In dry years. What are you saying? I'll buy it. He stared at her. Not for Consolidated's industrial price, Ruth said. At independently appraised agricultural value. No family discount in either direction. If the figure is close to recent county sales, I can pay cash. Her personal savings would feel the purchase. The roof, pump, first-year loss, and 3 years of living had already reduced them. Buying the strip would not endanger her home or the West Farm, but it would remove a large piece of the cushion Cal's estate had left. The land was worth the cost. It would widen the grass buffer, protect access to the upper fields, and keep another marginal strip from being forced into row crop. Dean put his cap on, then removed it again. That won't solve everything. No, it might cover the supplier account and the replanting note. That sounds like something. You'd be buying it cheap compared with Mercer. I'd be buying 14 acres. He wants everything. Dean looked toward the water. You planned this? I considered the strip before the rain. The rain improved the argument. You'd really use your own money? It has always been my own money. He flinched. Ruth had not meant the sentence as a blade, but she did not dull it afterward. Dean walked into the yard. His boots sank slightly near the tire ruts Carl Mercer's pickup had made years before. Grass now softened their edges. If I sell that piece, he said, we'll have to change the field access. Yes. And the home operation gets smaller again. Yes. You're buying us one payment, maybe two. I'm buying land I can use. What the sale buys you is your decision. He turned. You won't loan any of it back. No. Even secured? No. Dean nodded once. He drove away without agreeing. 3 days later, he called with the name of an appraiser. Ruth selected a second, and they used the average of the two figures. The survey took longer than expected because an old fence wandered across the boundary. Ruth paid half the cost. Dean paid the other half without asking her to carry him. The sale closed in early summer. Dean used the money to settle the overdue supplier account, repair the washed culvert, and cover part of the replanting. He sold another large tractor before harvest and contracted more field work instead of financing a replacement. The home operation shrank to the acreage it could support. The dealership did not survive in its old form. Dean sold the showroom building and most of the inventory to a regional company. He kept the service shop and worked under contract for the buyer, earning less status and steadier cash. Russell sold his remaining dealership share and moved his repair work into 2 rented bays beside Thomas's shop. On the morning the new sign went up, Tomas stood beneath it with his hands in his pockets. Vega Bell Equipment Service appeared in dark blue letters. Alphabetical, Russell said. Seniority, Tomas replied. You put my name second. I considered putting it inside. Ruth brought coffee. Marlene brought cinnamon rolls and claimed naming a business after 2 stubborn men violated truth in advertising laws. Dean came by near noon. He stood outside the open bay while Russell worked beneath a tractor. For a moment, Ruth expected him to leave. Then Dean removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and held the work light. Neither brother apologized. The tractor got fixed. At the West Farm, spring water receded without cutting new channels through the planted ground. Some of Ruth's oats yellowed from wet roots. A section of soybeans required replanting. The wheat lodged near the meadow edge and produced less than expected. The farm was not untouched. It was solvent. Evelyn's hay came off late but clean. The widened grass buffer on the 14 acres held during another heavy rain in July. Ruth planted only the driest portion and left the rest in cover, resisting the urge to make the purchase justify itself immediately. By August, the low meadows stood green and thick. Red-winged blackbirds nested among the reeds. Deer continued entering wherever they pleased, despite the money spent on fences. Ruth stopped taking that personally. The repaired equipment shed became the one place large enough for everyone to eat without using folding trays. The roof still leaned slightly, but Thomas reinforced the posts, Russell repaired the sliding door, and Evelyn hung clear work lights along the beams. Marlene found 6 mismatched tables at an estate sale and negotiated so aggressively that the seller called Ruth afterward to ask whether Marlene had always been like that. Yes, Ruth said. You recovered quickly. They held the supper after the last soybeans came off. Ruth roasted 2 hams in her home kitchen. Evelyn brought potatoes. Thomas brought beer and forgot ice. Marlene supplied pies, napkins, and criticism. Russell set up the tables. Dean arrived with 2 bags of ice and the electric carving knife. Marlene pointed at it. "I thought the dealership took that." Dean smiled. "Asset exclusion." The shed smelled of ham, machine oil, coffee, and cut hay. Rain tapped lightly against the roof without finding a way through. Ruth had invited Naomi Carter, the seed and feed supplier, who had worked with her on smaller orders, without insisting she buy what everybody used. Naomi arrived carrying a bowl of beans and stood near the workbench while Russell looked for an extension cord. "This is my mother, Ruth," he said. "She's the one who taught our dad how to farm." The room did not go silent, but it changed. Dean looked up from the ham. Thomas stopped twisting the cap from a beer. Marlene folded her arms, waiting. Ruth set down the stack of plates she was carrying. The old version of her might have accepted the praise because correcting it seemed ungrateful. Another version might have sharpened it into a judgment against Cal. Neither felt accurate. "I ran this place before either of them was born," she said. "Their father and I taught each other plenty. Then I left it in other hands for a long time." Naomi smiled. "And now? Now I chose to run it again." Russell nodded. "That's better. It is more accurate." Before supper, Ruth had asked Russell, Evelyn, and Thomas to sit with her at the folding table in the farmhouse. The arrangement she proposed was practical, not ceremonial. Evelyn would renew her hay lease for another 5 years, with a fixed purchase option on the acreage she had improved if Ruth ever decided to sell. Thomas would lease part of the shed for equipment storage and receive credit for structural improvements. Instead of donating labor, Ruth pretended not to notice. Russell would manage the cropped ground under a profit-sharing agreement, buying a small interest through cash and work each year, rather than receiving the farm merely because he was her son. Ruth would remain the owner and manager while she was able. After her, no one person would receive the whole farm by default. The people who had kept its different parts alive would have a clear path to continue them. Russell had read every page. "What about Dean?" he asked. Ruth looked at him. "Dean has a place here when he decides what work he wants to do." Dean was offered no unearned share, but neither was he exiled. That autumn, he contracted to service the grain bins and handle 2 equipment purchases through his new employer. He quoted fair prices. Ruth paid them on time. At supper, Dean carved the ham into slices, so even that Marlene accused him of using surveying equipment. Thomas raised his bottle. "To the person who finally fixed the west fence." "Which section?" Evelyn asked. They argued over credit until the food cooled. Ruth sat between Marlene and Dean. Across from her, Russell explained the next rotation to Naomi, while Evelyn corrected his assumptions about access. Thomas had grease beneath one thumbnail despite washing twice. No one at the table belonged there simply because Cal Bell had once occupied the head of another table. They belonged because they had arrived, worked, argued, paid, apologized when able, and returned. After supper, rain moved east. The clouds opened along the horizon, and evening light spread across the farm. Ruth carried Cal's mug from the farmhouse and filled it with coffee. She stood at the shed door while conversation continued behind her. Beyond the upper fields, the lowest ground shone beneath a thin layer of rainwater. There was no miraculous crop standing there, no proof that every acre could be made profitable if loved hard enough. There was grass. The meadow held the water quietly, exactly where Ruth remembered it belonged.